Hey guys, what's up? Today we're listening to Game of Thrones, the God Emperor of Planetos. So sit back, relax, and just enjoy the ride. And hey, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. And if you're one of the OGs, welcome back. You already know, it's about to get real.
Chapter 1, The Young Messiah I. What is the weight of knowing the past, present, and future? Does that make me a god or a mere mortal bold enough to see the world through God's eyes? Aenar Targaryen, before his conquest at the age of 6. 289 BC, 6th year of the reign of King Robert I Baratheon of House Baratheon. North Winterfell, ancestral home of House Stark. Jon, in one of the towers of Winterfell, looked at the men and more men gathering outside the castle. A sea of tents with banners fluttering in the cold north wind appeared before him, each bearing the coat of arms of the noble houses that controlled the north. Loyal men above all, brave. War. A word appeared in young Jon's mind, his deep purple eyes staring at the people gathering for war with a calm gaze. It was a simple word, but in the end its meaning was cruel and cold, almost like a god taking people's lives. War is a form of violence whose aim is to force the enemy to give up their will. The 6-year-old muttered to himself, his dark hair adorning his boyish face, a taciturn look reflected on his face. The kraken will drown while the deer, the lion, and the wolf feast on its corpse. He muttered again, feeling the cold breeze against his face. Although cold, he felt strangely at peace. Jon knew how this war would end before it had even begun. He had seen every important battle, the notable commanders of each side. Some ended up dead, and the kraken would mourn as it was forced to lose its last male offspring. War, do I want a war in my name? Jon asked himself, looking at the men excited to go to war, sharpening their axes, swords, and hammers. He imagined himself commanding these men, and the conclusion he felt was an enormous weight on his small, fragile shoulders. Jihad. A word that sent shivers through Jon's body. He shuddered from head to toe. He felt like a mountain was weighing on his head. The overwhelming feeling of anxiety welled up in his chest. Cries of the dead and prayers rang in his ears like a chorus of completely opposite dualities of good and evil. Control your emotions. Fear kills the mind and erodes your resolve. Jon muttered, gradually regaining his rationality. The feeling of anxiety gradually disappeared. In his eyes, all the men outside Winterfell were animals with no control over their emotions, but if he thought about it from that perspective, he too was an animal. As to which animal, Jon had yet to decide, but he preferred the biggest, for in this world of intrigue, only force can force another man to kneel before you. Dragon. Jon's eyes showed a look of desire, remembering his little partner now sleeping in Wolfwood. Taking one last look at Winterfell's sea of tents, Jon left without a second thought, his clothes predominantly black. Descending the spiral staircase step by step without haste or anxiety, Jon found himself in front of a corridor. He walked down the corridor where he passed the kitchen, where people came and went with extreme haste. No one paid any attention to the 6-year-old boy. Something that Jon appreciated, receiving looks of contempt in the morning was not pleasant, especially for his shaken psyche, although after 6 years, there were no words that made him feel any pain. Jon quickly returned to his room, or if a pantry could be considered a room in the first place. However, lying in bed he felt peace again. Even the visions of the future seemed to disappear in the silence of his room. His mind was pleasantly plagued by the silence he loved so much to be surrounded by. Lying on the bed, Jon stretched out his hand and looked at it. It was a child's hand. There were already calluses on it, showing that it had already started working at an early age, courtesy of a certain particularly degradable redfish in Winterfell. The irony of fate, me, the most powerful boy in the world, living in a dispensary and tormented by a stigma I never deserved to carry. Jon muttered to himself. He had known he was special for as long as he could remember, not because he was reincarnated with memories of another life, that of an 18-year-old. As well as learning things extremely quickly, such as languages and other things, including swordsmanship, he also had almost uninterrupted visions of the future, an ability he named prescience. The prescience showed him the past, present, and future, although the future was mostly covered in a thick fog and impossible to see through. But every now and then a wind would blow the fog away, allowing him to see certain possibilities that could happen. For Jon, it was more normal to see the past than the future, so he knew he wasn't the son everyone thought he was. However, even without the prescience, he would have known that he wasn't the son of the Lord Paramount of the North. The color of his eyes and having to dye his hair every week was a good indication of that. Lyanna Stark. A whisper escaped Jon's lips. He couldn't help but smile, remembering the visions of the past he had seen earlier. The 16-year-old girl who was his mother was a free spirit of nature, a nymph. She was beautiful in every way, noble in character and soul, and his father, Rhaegar, although not as noble in character, was a man of respect tormented by the same visions of the future, although nowhere near as powerful as his prescience. Did Jon resent his father and mother because of the cruel fate they had placed him in? The answer was no. How could he blame two people in love for loving each other? Besides, the entire responsibility of a kingdom couldn't be placed on just two people. It was a chain of events that resulted in the entire downfall of the Targaryen dynasty, a chain of events that stemmed from the Dance of the Dragons. Moreover, even without Rhaegar, the noble houses of Westeros would still rebel because of his grandfather, as Aerys Targaryen had chosen to detonate King's Landing with thousands of barrels containing wildfire. With Jaime Lannister still being forced to kill the king and earn the epithet of Killer of Kings. The North would rebel because of the deaths of their lord and the death of the heir of the North. The Riverlands followed along with the North because of the alliance between both great noble houses. The Vale, which started the war, and Storm's End would also join the rebellion because of Robert's loyalty to his stepbrother, Eddard Stark. The Tyrells would still side with the crown, and the Martells would still hate the Lannisters. At the end of the day, the war would still happen. Rhaegar and Lyanna were just other people's tools to incite the war faster. Jon liked to see the past, to learn from the mistakes of others so as not to make the same mistakes. It was his way of learning to live in this medieval world that seemed stagnant in time. He liked to see the conspiracies unfolding behind the walls and epic deaths over the years, such as the death of Daemon Targaryen and Aemon Targaryen in the Eye of God. My new family is complicated, Jon muttered to himself, yet he was happy to have another chance to live with a healthy body. Only he knows what it's like to spend a lifetime agonizing in pain while spending his days slowly rotting in bed without being able to move his body. So, even in the current harsh circumstances, he was happy to live again. He was healthy and able to move freely, he would build a future with his own hands, and he currently had a family who loved him, even though his uncle's wife was someone despicable in his eyes. Future, future and future, another and another tired word came from Jon's lips. There were things that even if he knew would happen in the future, he couldn't change anything. Even if he escaped to the most isolated desert in the world, even to the deepest sea and the highest place, there would be wars in his name, for so fate had decreed for him. No matter how much he escaped the fate decreed for him, it would still be by chaining him to a noble but equally terrible purpose. He would sit on the Iron Throne for a single purpose: the salvation of mankind. Chapter 2, The Young Messiah 2. Visenya Targaryen, the first queen of Westeros, looked around to see where she was at the moment. She found herself in what looked like a dark infinite space. Below her was a bridge made of a material that resembled dragon glass, two different extremely bright colors intertwined inside the dark crystal, these colors branching out like tree roots to all sides. With no option to walk sideways, she walked across the crystal bridge. Every time she stepped onto the bridge, the black crystal around her feet lit up, following her footsteps as she walked across the bridge. Visenya was calm. Not many things could make her nervous or afraid. The Dark Sister was ready to be drawn from her scabbard at any moment, eager to drink the blood of her enemies at any moment. The first queen of Westeros didn't know how long she had been walking, but her journey had finally come to an end. The queen's lilac eyes fixed themselves almost instantly on the small figure at the end of the crystal bridge. She could recognize the white gold hair, a very rare color, even when Valyria was still standing. Reaching the boy's side, Visenya didn't speak to him and looked at what lay at the end of the bridge. It was an extremely beautiful place, under a dark background, lights of different colors intertwined with each other creating what looked like a circle of bright lights. It's the nexus of all time and space, a place where the mere concept of time is irrelevant. Here, even a blind man could see some scenes from the past, present and perhaps with luck, the future itself. Visenya heard the child speak in a calm voice. He sounded like a small adult, a taciturn look, with a slight sadness reflected on his face. A look that reminded one of her brother/husband. Aegon always made the same expression when he had dragon dreams. "What's your name, boy?" Visenya asked with a regal tone worthy of a queen long in power. A powerful queen who didn't take disrespect lightly. She even wanted to burn Old Town with Vagor to show her power. The boy looked at her, causing the queen to notice the beautiful dark purple eyes looking back at her with a hint of curiosity reflected in his eyes. Due to less than pleasant circumstances, I am currently known as Jon Snow, your grace, he replied, causing Visenya to once again show an expression of surprise. The boy in front of her shouted his Valyrian descent from head to toe, but he was still called Jon Snow, a name she knew was given to bastards from the north. And your other name? Visenya questioned the boy once more. The curiosity in her eyes could not be hidden. Everything from the beginning that appeared in this place seemed too incredible. She tried to remember the last memory she could recall, but she couldn't find out anything about it. Aenar Targaryen, rightful heir to the Iron Throne and currently living with a mere bastard in the north. If before the boy's words had surprised her, now she was completely incredulous. And why is the rightful heir to my noble house living as a bastard in the north? She asked, her voice regal and full of fury hidden in her apparently calm gaze. Those lilac eyes stared at the boy, waiting for his answer. It seemed as if there was a flame burning in her eyes. Looking at the elderly woman next to him, Jon couldn't help but smile. The woman believed his words without any hesitation. He could feel her fury, indignant at his situation. She was furious for someone she had never met. It moved him a little. Holding her hand, Jon spoke in a soft tone. The Targaryen dynasty has fallen. There are only 5 members of House Targaryen left in the world. Some have been exiled to Essos and are currently being hunted like animals and starving in the streets. The other languishes in the north, serving for over 100 years as maester. One is trapped in her never-ending quest for revenge. Visenya felt her brain go blank for a moment. She gritted her teeth and looked at the child holding her hand. Her voice was tinged with the purest fury and violence imaginable. How is this possible, and who dared touch my family? Dragons are now extinct. Most were killed in the Dance of the Dragons, a civil war between House Targaryen. Still, the Targaryen dynasty survived for over 170 years without dragons, only destroyed by my grandfather who went mad and did every atrocity no king could commit. Jon explained calmly as his eyes stared into the nexus of time and space. He already had an idea of who this old woman next to him was, and why she was in this place that only he could enter. The shadow sister on the scabbard was a clear indication of her identity. Visenya was silent for a moment, not knowing what she was thinking. Turning to the boy holding her hand, the rightful heir to the Iron Throne and House Targaryen, she spoke with a cold, indifferent tone. Boy, I'm going to teach you something you mustn't forget. A king bows to no one, does not care about the opinions of others or even respect the law. We are Targaryen and we bring fire and blood to our enemies. Your grandfather was weak, that's why he died. Jon couldn't help but cluck his tongue in admiration. The woman was truly strong as written in the books he had read. Visenya Targaryen, Knight of Vagor and bearer of the Dark Sister, first Queen of Westeros and mother of Maegor the Cruel. It may be true what you say, your grace, but it's been a long time since we've had dragons to force the other houses to their knees. Aegon V tried to make some reforms for the good of the people, but over the next month, numerous nobles blocked his reform plans. There were many talented kings like Aegon V, Mikar I, Daeron II, but without dragons, what could House Targaryen do to fight the huge armies of the great noble houses? Jon replied with a sad tone. What was sadder for a talented ruler without the power to make his reforms? Visenya stroked the boy's white gold hair and spoke in a softer tone. My descendants were good at keeping the dynasty going for so long without dragons. There were no lies in her words. She really admired the achievements of her descendants, for without dragons, even Aegon would be helpless to conquer an entire continent. What have I come here for, boy? Even though she didn't know what was going on, Visenya knew that something was very wrong, for she was talking to her descendant from hundreds of years in the future. You're dead. My subconscious, knowing that I needed proper teachers for me to learn to rule, brought your dead consciousness from a different time-space to this place, the nexus of time and space. Jon commented in a gentle tone, afraid of stressing out the former queen of Westeros. But to Jon's surprise, the queen was apparently very calm, showing no reaction of surprise at his words. Visenya, on hearing that she was dead, wasn't surprised. She was talking to her descendant from the future. There was no way she could be alive, but although she didn't want to admit it, deep down she was sad to hear that she was dead. She wanted to see what her son's reign would be like. Is the long night coming again? Visenya asked, pushing those feelings aside. At this moment, she had an even greater responsibility. Jon wasn't surprised to hear Visenya's question. It was obvious that her husband had told her about the Song of Ice and Fire. Yes, along with it, an army of hundreds of thousands of undead who don't need to eat, rest, or even feel pain, as well as being almost immortal, being killed by just 3 things. Visenya's face turned grim. Apart from the long night, his descendant had to deal with an army of undead, fight all that without dragons. Looking at his calm face, the queen couldn't help but admire her descendant. Even her son Maegor or Eni's trash are no match for this child with a name less than 10 days old. You'll make a good king, Enar. Visenya commented, ruffling his hair with a touch of tenderness in her eyes. Unfortunately, without dragons your journey will be difficult, even with my teachings. She spoke with a helpless tone. It was completely unrealistic to fight an undead army without dragons. Who says I don't have a dragon? For the 3rd time Jon's words surprised Visenya. Visenya laughed and spoke in an amused tone. I didn't know you were the father of dragons. Forgive my ignorance, your grace. I'm a magnanimous prince. You're forgiven, my queen. Jon joined in the banter and spoke with a smile. Now let's begin your training. Visenya spoke, unsheathing the dark sister, making Jon's face show obvious helplessness. He felt he was going to suffer a little. Chapter 3, The Young Messiah 3. There is no escape. We pay for the violence of our ancestors, thought Enar Targaryen under the hate-filled eyes of King Baratheon. Jon awoke in his bed, his eyes calm despite the incredible experience that had just taken place. Meeting Visenya Targaryen, the first queen of Westeros, was a pleasant encounter that he had not foreseen with his prescience. He quickly realized that time in the time-space nexus was different from the real world. He had spent days training with Visenya, but looking out the window it hadn't been more than a few hours. It looked like he had taken a simple nap. Remembering the old but undeniably strong woman pointing her sword at him, Jon felt his lips curl into a smile. Getting out of bed, he walked over to a bucket and washed his face. It was his favorite time of day, breakfast, and perhaps the last breakfast he would have with his uncle before he went off to war again after 6 years of rebellion. After making sure there was nothing wrong with his clothes, Jon left the room without a second thought. The corridors of Winterfell were busier than ever. Warriors and more warriors passed him, some looking at him with curiosity, others with thinly veiled disdain. But most ignored him as if he didn't even exist. Jon didn't know if it hurt more to be despised or ignored, but he was used to such looks and continued his walk until he reached the mess hall where everyone ate every morning, lunch and dinner. Opening the doors to the hall, Jon found his family eating along with several other northern lords, the most prominent of whom were Big Jon of House Umber and Jorah of House Mormont, along with his aunt Meage Mormont. The only reason for mentioning Jorah was that the man had a very important role to play in the future. Otherwise Jon wouldn't even look at a man who would sell people in the future to satisfy a pompous, self-centered woman. You have arrived, Jon. Come and sit beside me. Jon's attention was drawn to the powerful yet strangely calm voice. Eddard Stark, Lord of House Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Lord Paramount of the North. Jon noticed that the man was young, 26 years old, with brown hair down to his shoulders and dark gray eyes that could be as soft as mist or as hard as stone when angry. Standing next to the Warden of the North was the son of House Stark, Robb Stark, a child of 6 who, with his auburn hair and blue eyes, looked like his mother in every way. On the left was the Lady of the North and daughter of the noble House Tully, beautiful and elegant with her red hair and blue eyes. If Jon hadn't met her, he would have taken her for a virtuous woman. Unfortunately, she was only virtuous in appearance, nothing more than a trophy wife with no backbone and no respect for the traditions of the North. The woman could be especially cruel when she wanted to, wishing him dead and doing many other unkind things to a child. In her arms was a girl who bore an unmistakable resemblance to her, the eldest daughter of House Stark, Sansa Stark, who was no more than 1 year old. She was the cutest thing in the world, but she would become an exact copy of her mother, dreaming of princes and knights of the South. Something she might regret in the future if he didn't stop certain things from happening. That was all House Stark for now. There would be more to come, but he put that aside for a moment before sitting down next to Robb, ignoring the dangerous, deadly stare that fell upon him. I thought you overslept. Robb commented with a smile as he devoured a chicken leg. His eyes met Jon's dark purple ones and he smiled amicably. They were brothers except for the blood that ran through their veins. Jon shrugged and answered nonchalantly, lying as normally as he breathed. It was hard to sleep with all that noise the night before. Robb agreed, the mobilization of the army was indeed noisy. As he tore off a piece of bread and put it in his mouth, Jon felt the deadly stare next to him again. Lifting his gaze, he saw the blue eyes of Catelyn Stark, born Tully, staring at him without hiding the disgust in her eyes. Swallowing his bread, Jon drank some water and asked nonchalantly, "Something wrong, Lady Stark?" Jon's words drew the attention of all the lords present, who watched with amusement at what was about to happen. "A bastard can't dine with us." Catelyn didn't care that her husband was present and spoke without hiding her extreme dislike for the bastard. Robb looked at his mother with a frown, the same look that was on the Lord of Winterfell's face at that moment. Robb was unhappy with his mother's words, while Eddard was unhappy with his wife's attitude toward their bannermen. What would they think of him? A man who couldn't control his wife? Letting out a laugh that left everyone looking at the 6-year-old in surprise, Jon replied calmly, "The last time I remember, I was invited to sit down by Lord Stark. As a vassal, I must obey my lord." "Are you saying your will is above that of your own husband and lord, Lady Stark?" Jon didn't stop and landed another blow on Catelyn. "Worthy of a 7-worshipping southerner who despises our ways." If everyone had been watching the fun before, now all the lords were looking at Catelyn with increasingly unfriendly eyes. They already didn't like the fact that their lord had married a southerner, especially after the woman opened a 7 church in Winterfell. Jon's words only reminded them of the dislike they felt for Lady Stark. And it was so simple that Jon wanted to laugh right then, but he held himself back as he prepared to watch the show while Catelyn dug her own grave and jumped in alone without him doing anything. Although the woman had beauty, she definitely didn't have enough intelligence, something that few women in this world had, given the little or no education they received from their noble houses. There were few truly intelligent women in this world, Olenna Tyrell being one of the few, the fame of the Queen of Thorns circulating for years even in the far north. As Catelyn felt the increasingly unfriendly looks being thrown her way, she felt her cheeks flush with shame and anger, her eyes practically spitting flames from how angry she was at the moment. Not only had she been despised by a bastard, she had thrown him to the lions to defend herself against accusations of disloyalty. Unfortunately, Jon had forgotten that his uncle was present. How could a husband fail to defend his wife? "Enough." Eddard spoke, his voice causing the many eyes of the lords to turn away and go back to eating, though some still looked at Catelyn with much dissatisfaction in their eyes, Jon Umber and Meege Mormont. Jon ate his bread with a vague disappointment in his eyes, but when he noticed Eddard's look, he quickly hid his expression and ate with an innocent look on his face as he winked playfully at the Lord Paramount of the North. He just snorted coldly as he went back to eating, probably planning how to scold him when he returned from the war. Jon wasn't worried about that. With Eddard Stark gone to war, Winterfell would be handed over to a temporary regent, and the regent was obviously Catelyn Stark, Lady of Winterfell. He could foresee that Catelyn would make his life a living hell when Eddard wasn't around. But the heir to the Iron Throne wasn't worried. First, he had plenty of ways to make the Redfish regret her choices, and second, he could live in the forest for a few months without a problem. So he really wasn't worried at all about what his life would be like if Eddard went to war against House Greyjoy. "Sorry about my mother, Jon," Robb said, sitting down next to Jon, his voice lower than usual and showing a bit of embarrassment on the boy's part. Unlike Sansa in the future, Robb actually treated him like a real brother. His mother's actions seemed to hurt the boy more than Jon himself, who was the target of the insults. "Don't worry, if I cared about other people's words, I would have killed myself a long time ago." Jon placed his hand on the heir of Winterfell's shoulder and spoke with a small smile. Just as Robb treated him like a brother, Jon treated Robb like a brother. The two were inseparable, especially during swordplay lessons. The smile returned to Robb's face at Jon's words and he began to eat, sharing the start of his day.
Look, if you've actually made it this far into the video and you're still here, come on then, hit subscribe. And honestly, if you think a friend of yours would like this, go on and share it with them. It really helps out. Right, I'm done. I'll get out of your hair now so you can get back to the good stuff. But seriously, stick around till the end. It's well worth it.
Chapter 4: The Dragon and Rider Eye. His flesh may be made of fire and his blood as hot as magma, he may be of a completely different race than mine, but we are undeniably brothers. Brothers bonded until the day I die, or if the gods so choose, something I pray every night will not happen, his death. Aenar Targaryen, reflecting on his bond with his dragon. The next day, Eddard Stark and his bannermen went to war again. 35,000 seasoned men and a few women from Bear Island. All already baptized in the fire and steel of war. Another 15,000 would join along the way, making a total of 50,000 men and women, and the army would march to the battlefield. Westeros was experiencing its first war since the rebellion that led to the destruction of House Targaryen. Knowing that Catelyn would act as regent and rule all of Winterfell in Lord Stark's absence, Jon decided to spare the life of his uncle's wife and, after saying goodbye to Robb, left for Wolfswood with a dagger and some food and water supplies. His departure attracted no attention except from Robb himself, but knowing what his mother might do to Jon, he remained silent even when questioned by his mother. Even though other people knew of Jon's departure, they didn't care. They all had their own lives to tend to instead of worrying about the life of a bastard. Wolfswood was a large forest, its huge oaks looking ancient and strangely twisted. It wasn't just oaks that inhabited the forest. Sentinels, soldier pines, and hawthorn, beech, ash, chestnut, ironwood, fir, and many tall pines. Weirwoods were occasionally found singly or in pairs. In addition to the trees, there were wolves, bears, wild boars, deer, elk, fish, foxes, rabbits, tree cats, black squirrels, and emperor spiders. In short, it was not a forest friendly to humans, let alone a small, fragile 6-year-old boy, the favorite prey of many of the predators that lived in this forest. Jon knew this, and so his every move consisted of using his prescience as much as he could at the moment, avoiding predators like wolves and bears for the most part. However, the ability couldn't be used 24 hours a day, which put the 6-year-old through some very dangerous times when he found himself facing a particularly hungry giant brown bear. If he hadn't been much more agile than the bear and hadn't managed to escape after circling the trees and squeezing into small, narrow spaces, he would probably have had to fight a bear at the age of 6, not an easy task with only a dagger. A distance that should have taken half a day stretched into 5 long days. And at the end of the 5th day, Jon finally came to a relatively open clearing in front of a huge stone wall, the entrance to a cave. Tired, dirty, and hungry, Jon sat down on the green grass and looked at the cave entrance. Seeing no movement from it, he focused his gaze on the stone wall, where there were claw marks that no normal animal could ever make. They were huge marks, almost the size of a relatively tall person. If anyone had seen them, they would probably have been frightened, wondering what gigantic monster had made those marks in the hard stone. Curiously, there were other claw marks on the stone, but of a different size, almost as if to show the gradual growth of the beast. Observing the marks for a while, Jon concluded that his favorite winged reptile had grown again since the last time he had seen it, about a year and a few months ago. Noticing the twilight shadows on the surrounding pines, Jon knew that another night was quickly approaching. Without wasting any time, he began gathering dry twigs and stones to build a fire. Normally, he wouldn't dare build a fire in the middle of the forest, but since he was in the territory of a predator of the highest rank in the world's food chain, he knew that many large animals would never come close to where he was. After some effort to light a spark with 2 stones, Jon found himself warming himself in front of the orange flames of the campfire, warding off the terrible and deadly cold of the north. He reached into his pack, pulled out a dead squirrel, and without hesitation and his knife, began to clean the squirrel, apparently his meal for the night. If it was difficult to survive in the forest during the day, the level increased dramatically at night. While waiting for the squirrel to be ready for the fire, Jon noticed that the darkness had already consumed everything around him. He could barely see a meter in front of him. Wolf howls could be heard deep in the forest. The whole forest seemed to be waking up, and so did its predators. Jon was not intimidated by the sounds of the predators. He had already spent 7 days in the forest before, something that made his uncle dig up almost every stone in Wolfswood looking for him. This time, though dangerous, was even easier as his powers matured. A tantalizing, juicy smell hung in the air as hunger ravaged the empty space in Jon's stomach. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps from the cave entrance caught the 6-year-old's attention. The footsteps were heavy and came with a sound that resembled something dragging, trills and guttural roars that reached Jon, causing his lips to lift in a very happy smile. After all, it had been so long since they had met, he was very happy right now. As the footsteps came dangerously close, John felt the temperature around him rise as what he assumed to be sulfur and smoke hung in the air along with the breeze. A pungent and even unpleasant smell to most people, but to him it was a comforting scent that represented the greatest power in the world today. Suddenly, out of the darkness that engulfed the forest, a huge draconic face emerged, its crimson scales partially illuminated by the flickering orange light of the campfire. Anyone else would probably have a heart attack when they saw a huge head the size of a meter appear next to them. But no, John, he wasn't at all surprised or frightened by the huge head appearing next to him. He looked at the dragon with a smile that showed his impeccable white teeth. "I see you're all right, you greedy dragon." John spoke in High Valyrian, the legitimate High Valyrian, not the bastardized versions of the 9 free cities. The language was so beautiful that to other people's ears what he said was no different than singing. The dragon gave a seemingly dissatisfied trill at his words and rested its huge head on the ground next to its rider. The red eyes, like hot coals, stared at John with an unyielding but strangely calm gaze. "It's good to see you too, Caraxes," John said, stroking the warm scales of the draconic face with a smile on his lips. He couldn't have been happier to be beside him right now. For 144 years the world didn't know it, but in the year 283 after Aegon's conquest, dragons came back to life. He was born from an egg mysteriously laid in a cave in Wolfswood on the same day John was born. After he was born, John, who was still a baby, saw the dragon being born through prescience, even though they were thousands of miles apart. Without knowing each other personally, they formed a bond that ignored distance. Looking away from Caraxes, John picked up the squirrel that looked ready to eat, and instead of starting to eat it, he cut it in half with his knife. He kept one half and the other half went into Carax's mouth, which did not fill the gaps in the crimson beast's teeth, but it was not hunger that mattered at that moment, but companionship and the act of sharing the same food. Something that has been used since ancient times to establish friendly relationships and to show one's character and nobility in front of others. After all, even a cruel man doesn't refuse food after a long walk. Taking a bite of the roasted squirrel, John looked at his companion and commented, spitting out a few small bones. "Even if you only fly at night, there are still many reports of a crimson beast flying through the skies." Caraxes let out a high-pitched trill and turned his face away, making John roll his eyes at the dragon's stubbornness. John knew very well that Caraxes hated hiding, the dragon wanted to be free and untamed as he should be, and he hated being separated from him even more. "I know you don't like to hide, but it is of utmost importance to me that you grow up in silence. I ask you to wait 6 years and we will bring the flames of war back to this continent." Still speaking in High Valyrian, John stroked the dragon's crimson scales and spoke in a persuasive tone. He was not Carax's master, their status was equal. Though reluctant, the dragon responded by poking John's small body with its head, almost causing the 6-year-old to trip and fall. John just laughed and continued to eat, enjoying the presence of someone he considered a friend and brother. Chapter 5: The Dragon and Rider 2. When religion, royalty and hard times go hand in hand, it's a sign that a real hell is about to break out. And the end will certainly not be kind to me or my children. Aenar Targaryen thought as he watched the people kneel before him, worshipping him like a god. John rose early, as he had for the past month. Within the nexus of time and space, his fencing lessons, dragon riding, and blood magic lessons had become a routine for him. Visenya Targaryen didn't hold back when she spoke of the entire legacy of House Targaryen, knowledge lost in suspicious fires clearly orchestrated by people who didn't want to see magic spread throughout Westeros. He had an idea of who had been slowly and patiently destroying House Targaryen's legacy. The Faith of the Seven and the Order of the Maesters. Both organizations with extreme power and influence in Westeros and the main culprits behind many of the tragedies that had befallen House Targaryen. Revenge that John would bring with fire and blood at the right time. Blood magic, however, was a strange art. Not only could it be used to prolong one's life through sacrifice, but it could also change the body of the user if they so wished. In his Visenya lessons, John discovered that after 5,000 years of existence, blood magic had become so prevalent in the blood of the 40 houses of dragon lords that many of them had quite exotic abilities. Some could control multiple swords with their minds, while others were faster and stronger than any living human. The creation of chimeras was just the tip of the iceberg of blood magic. They had so many uses and tools that were sadly lost when Valyria sank into magma and death. Although it was an interesting art, Jon didn't care much for it. The Targaryen gained the ability to predict the future through sleep, known as dragon dreams, but this ability became ridiculously strong in him due to prescience. Something that Visenya agreed with, saying that he was the most talented Targaryen in 5,000 years. To the point of being able to see the past, present, and future at will. Yawning, Jon left the cave and found himself standing in front of a huge crimson creature warming itself in the sun. It was about 20 meters long and twice as wide with its wings fully outstretched. Note, 20 meters is about 65 feet. With 2 short hind legs and 2 large wings for forearms, a hideous triangular face covered with scales along a long slender neck, the small horns pointing upward resembled the face of a demon. Similar to the face of Caraxes in House of the Dragon. Its chest was strong, imposing, and muscular. Along the spine, spikes of fins protruding upward looked especially fierce and intimidating. The huge, strong body looked extremely intimidating. The huge dragon was covered with shiny crimson scales that shone like metal plates. However, because it was a young dragon, its scales didn't have the strong defensive power to stop even a scorpion's arrows. Something only adult dragons could do. The dragon was obviously Caraxes, Jon's dragon. Just like his rider, the dragon was about 6 years old, but as big as a 40-year-old, showing that rider and dragon were obviously special. After all, dragons couldn't grow that fast, but it just showed how special Caraxes and his rider were. Good morning. Jon greeted his companion in High Valyrian, a language Caraxes understood. Dragons were almost as intelligent as humans, but unlike human society, where socialization was important, dragons had a very simple society based on solitude. If it weren't for ancient Valyria, dragons would never have stuck together so much. A dragon's routine boiled down to 2 things: digging caves in warm places, sleeping, eating, and when it was time to mate, mating with a female. Caraxes opened his eyes when he heard the greeting, but closed them the next second as he let out a high-pitched trill, not moving a muscle and staying warm in the sun. Jon didn't mind and walked towards the stream near the clearing, about 100 meters away. The biggest advantage of living near a dragon was that large animals rarely entered his territory. Washing his face with the cold but clean water of the stream, Jon opened his eyes and looked at the woman dressed in red on the other side of the stream, a graceful smile on her red lips while her ruby-red eyes stared at him with a warm intensity. Behind her, dozens of men and women also stared at him with a fantastic light in their eyes. The woman who seemed to be the leader of the group was wearing a beautiful red dress, which, by the way, was perfectly clean and unscratched despite being in the depths of a forest, and a beautiful necklace with a ruby adorned her graceful neck. Her curly black hair fell over her shoulders and breasts. Jon couldn't help but feel an enormous weight at the sight of the woman. It wasn't fear, but a feeling of helplessness in the face of fate. He could feel the leash of destiny around his neck, preventing him from rebelling. In the eyes of the woman before him, he was the chosen one, the Messiah, the personification of God walking in the mortal world, but in Jon's eyes he himself was a prisoner with a glorious destiny, but a prisoner nonetheless. When the woman tried to speak, Jon ignored her and returned to the clearing, apparently not wanting to engage her in conversation. Kinvara smiled as she watched the beautiful child disappear and followed in her beautiful gown, which seemed uncomfortable in the harshness of the forest, but her helpers, the fiery hand, devotedly cleared the path for her. High Priestess, the Child of Light? Another red-haired priestess asked with a worried expression. They had come to North Westeros to find the Son of Light, but apparently the Son of Light himself didn't want to see them, as evidenced by the angry look on his face when they saw him. Don't worry, Melina, the Lord of Light will clear up your doubts soon. Kinvara replied with a gentle smile as she continued to stare at the beautiful child's back with a look that would probably make many people on Earth mistake her for a pedophile. Melina let out a tired sigh as she listened to the High Priestess' words. She could feel the weakness in her body, and even the resistance to cold and heat she usually possessed seemed to weaken. They had spent a lot of magic to camouflage their appearance to infiltrate the North in the middle of a war. But her faith never wavered for a second. On the contrary, the difficult and deadly journey only strengthened her and everyone else's faith. It happened the moment they saw the child looking at them with his beautiful purple eyes. Kinvara had walked about 100 meters when she finally crossed some trees and found herself in front of a clearing. The eyes of the High Priestess of the Red Temple of Volantis focused almost instantly on Jon beside the gigantic crimson beast. A smile appeared on the high priestess' lips at the sight of the beautiful and deadly creature's color. This was obviously another sign from the Lord of Light. Kinvara could hear the gasps of fear and admiration from her subordinates, some of whom even knelt on the ground and bowed before the child and the dragon. She was pleased to see the people's devotion to the Son of Light, the one who would bend the world to his will and bring hope for the battles to come in the years to come. But though the priests and priestesses and the fiery hand seemed happy, Caraxes didn't like the ants invading his territory. The huge head of the dragon moved towards the group of people with a menacing growl. Ruwa! It opened its mouth and let out a deafening roar while a crimson flame glowed deep in its throat, ready to consume the intruders. And to the secret relief of Kinvara and the others, Jon spoke in High Valyrian with a calm tone as he stroked the dragon's neck. Calm down, Caraxes. They're not food, at least not yet. Though dissatisfied, Caraxes closed his mouth and looked at the intruders, expressing his dissatisfaction. Hunt a deer or something big to calm the dragon's anger. Kinvara ignored Jon's words in High Valyrian, a language she understood, and ordered in a calm voice, looking at her subordinates who nodded and four fiery hand quickly walked toward the forest. Turning to look at Jon, she clasped her hands together on her stomach and gently bowed forward as she introduced herself. Allow me to introduce myself, Son of Light. I am Kinvara, High Priestess of the Red Temple of Volantis, the Flame of Truth, the Light of Wisdom and the first servant of the Lord of Light. Currently only Jon Snow. Looking at the beautiful woman, Jon replied in a calm, unconscious tone, his voice carrying a hint of majesty he hadn't noticed from spending so much time with Visenya. Chapter 6, The Messiah and the Red Priestess. Manipulation is an essential art for any worthy monarch. My father was a master of this craft. His sweet words and overwhelming charisma made it impossible to say no, even when we knew his requests were questionable. In the end, before we knew it, we were at his feet, worshipping him as a supreme being. In God Emperor of the Planetos, The Life of Enar Targaryen by Princess Alysanne Targaryen. Looking into the eyes of the woman in red, Jon knew that behind the calm, elegant and composed look she displayed was a mad fanaticism that, if he asked, the woman could burn the entire continent without question if she so wished. Jon looked away from her and focused his gaze on Caraxes, his brother still angry that the intruders had entered his territory. He could see that if there was any sign of hostility towards him, Caraxes would turn everyone to ash in a matter of seconds. Easy, brother, we fly at night. Jon spoke in High Valyrian, his whisper seeming to calm the crimson dragon's wrath. Caraxes took one last look at the ants that had dared to enter his territory and returned to the cave with his heavy footsteps. The entrance to the cave obscured his huge crimson body. I have to admit, you're very brave to come to the north in these times of war. Sitting by the fire, Jon commented as he tried to rekindle the fire to cook his breakfast, a rabbit he had caught the day before. The faith of the Red God may be popular and widely accepted in Essos, but in Westeros they were nothing more than pagans with barbaric rituals, along with their filthy blood and fire magic. Even if they were killed, no lord would seek justice for them. The south of Westeros despised the old gods, let alone a foreign faith that burned people alive, so the courage of Kinvara and the others was truly commendable. Allow me, your grace. Kinvara watched as he tried to light the flames, and with a simple wave of her hand, flames appeared on the dry branches of the bonfire. She then sat down beside him, looking at him with a polite smile. Jon looked at the woman with a silent gaze, narrowed his eyes and spoke in a calm tone. What do you want from me, Red Priestess? Only what you wish, my lord. Kinvara answered without hesitation. If I ask you to kill yourself here and now, will you do it? Jon also answered without hesitation, his face tinged with a hint of coldness. If your grace wishes, I will. Drawing a dagger from the sleeves of her dress, Kinvara responded by placing a cold blade against her own neck. The blade sank slightly into her skin, a drop of blood appearing on her white skin. A smile appeared on Jon's face, the coldness on his face vanishing. Your loyalty is commendable, Lady Kinvara. But I beg you not to kill yourself. I will need your services for a long time to come. Long enough to see every man grow old and die. An equally happy smile appeared on the priestess' lips, Jon's words not unlike the most beautiful song in her ears. His words indicated that she would serve him for hundreds of years. How could that not make her happy? Nothing could make her happier than to serve her God for eternity. Jon looked at the woman who was probably hundreds of years old. She seemed as happy as a child who had just earned her favorite toy. He couldn't help but think how frightening human faith was, but he didn't complain about the benefits he was gaining. He knew that the red faith would be his sharpest sword against the faith of the seven. He would destroy that seven-faced religious organization with his bare hands. But to do that, Jon had to make changes to the red faith, to make it more palatable to the eyes of the commoners, to remove the image of crazed fanatics burning people. I know the purpose of your coming, but you're too early. My conquest will not begin until 296. Jon commented, watching the orange flames as he heard the crackling of branches breaking in front of the flames. He wasn't lying, it really was the year he would begin his conquest. Instead of staying in the shadows, he would attack Robert Baratheon head-on, drawing all the noble houses into a war that would be remembered forever in the history of mankind. Kinvara couldn't help but notice that Jon was simply brilliant, not at all like a 6-year-old boy, but a man in a child's body. What 6-year-old boy could conspire against an entire continent at that age? But it only reinforced what she knew about the Son of Light. He will bring hope when the eternal night comes and take humanity to a new level, one that no king has ever reached, even in the mighty old Valyrian Empire. The red faith is yours, your grace. Our swords, our magic, our bodies and our souls are yours. Kinvara rose and knelt at Jon's feet, her voice full of devotion and awe as she dared not look the 6-year-old child in the eye. Behind her, all the fiery hand and priestesses knelt with her, waiting for his words. Standing, Jon looked at the kneeling people, and though he didn't want millions to die in a religious war because of him, the world demanded that he become king. I accept your allegiance and the oath that each of you swears to me. I promise to rule with justice and wisdom, and in return I ask for your faith and courage in times when darkness threatens to engulf us. He spoke, his voice grave, calm, and confident. When Jon finished speaking, everyone stood up and looked at him with excited and fanatical eyes, and under his confused eyes, Kinvara gestured to his subordinates and a man with a silk package in his arms approached. Your Grace, this is a gift prepared by the God of Light. Kinvara spoke, taking the silk package and handing it devoutly to Jon, who accepted the gift without a second thought. He removed the silk that wrapped the gift and a sword appeared in Jon's arms. It was a beautiful sword, its blade 1 meter long, no more than 2 fingers wide. The most beautiful thing about the sword was the blade itself, pale as milky glass, as if the light bathed the sword in its golden glow. The guard was made of silver, with beautiful intricate patterns in the metal, and there were 2 rubies at the ends of each guard. The hilt, like the guard, was made of silver with beautiful patterns carved into the metal, and the pommel was a ruby the size of an egg. It was truly worthy of a sword wielded by kings, emphasizing royal majesty and beauty. Jon recognized the material. It was meteorite iron, the same material used in the design of the legendary sword of House Dane from Starfall Dawn. However, meteorite iron wasn't exactly the most common metal in the world, especially since it was the only metal capable of competing with Valyrian steel, being even rarer than the latter. Perhaps sensing his puzzled expression, Kinvara replied in a respectful tone. This is the meteorite that tore through the skies of Essos on the day the Son of Light was born. We recovered it, and after 4 years of forging, we were able to forge the sword that your grace will wield. Jon nodded and touched the blade with his finger. He couldn't help but feel a connection to the sword. It felt warm to the touch of his finger, despite the cold light it emitted in contact with the sunlight. Lady Leia. Jon murmured the name of the sword, his mother's name. He could imagine his uncle's expression when he heard the name of the sword. It would certainly be an amusing sight to watch. The Red Faith has my thanks. Jon spoke, still looking at the sword, and the more he looked, the more amazed he became. His eyes even took on a phosphorescent glow that caught the attention of Kinvara and everyone else present. Your blade will be stained with the cold blood of the enemy of mankind. It will pierce the heart of the Night King and end the long night. Jon spoke slowly, not caring if anyone heard him or not. He wanted everyone to hear him. The divination of his image was more than essential. Any king would do this, he would do it no differently. Whether it was Kinvara or anyone else present, they took a deep breath as they listened to the prophecy. The eyes of these people could no longer be called pious. They were fanatics in every sense of the word. If Jon told them to go to King's Landing and kill Robert Baratheon, they would go without a second thought. Afraid of death? In their eyes, death was just a new beginning. After death, they would go to their master's kingdom to continue serving their god, and that's all someone like them wanted. Jon knew this and manipulated his every word to satisfy the desires of these fanatics. He simply said what they wanted to hear and they believed him, whether it was true or not. Chapter 7, The Messiah and the Red Priestess 2. I remember once when I was a child cuddling on my father's lap. He told me that the faith of the people was something terrible. At the time I didn't understand what he was saying, but later when I saw an entire city on its knees before him, I understood. To them he was a god. And yet he seemed so alone. Maybe that's the burden of being a god. A burden that I too will carry one day. Princess Alysanne Targaryen, Primarch of the Blood. Jon bathed in the brook, oblivious to the intense cold of the water. He had never really felt cold or hot since his rebirth. The weather didn't matter to him. Maybe it was the magic in his blood, a magic of fire and ice. Both lineages were powerful enough to make anyone special, but he had both in his body. Maybe fate liked to play with other people's lives in a very ironic and somewhat sadistic way. "Can I help you, Your Grace?" Hearing the woman's voice behind him, Jon couldn't help but look over his shoulder. The woman was as naked as the day she was born. If someone in the north saw her, they would surely call her mad for bathing in the north without clothes. It was quite deadly in the intense cold of the vast northern lands. As for her body, he had to admit that the gods really did make women more perfect than men. The naked woman in front of him was simply breathtaking, her full breasts and pink nipples, her slender body and beautiful legs. His eyes traveled down her body without hiding his gaze. "Do what you want," Jon replied, also naked. Though he had the mind of an adult, his body was 6 years old, and that was an age when you couldn't get hard even if you wanted to, something he was grateful for. With his complete inexperience with women, he was sure he would get hard when he saw a naked woman as stunning as Kinvara. As soon as Jon said this, he felt a body pressing up behind him, soft, gentle hands stroking his hair, something Jon found incredibly relaxing. Unconsciously, he leaned back, appreciating the services of the High Priestess of Volantis. "What would you like to ask, Lady Kinvara?" Jon asked with his eyes closed, almost melting at the woman's hands. Perhaps because she was a red priestess, she had a fiery aura about her that made the northern atmosphere slightly warmer. "Your Grace, I would like to ask if you have ever had the pleasure of seeing our Lord in person?" Jon heard the soft, low whisper, as if she was afraid to disturb his rest. At her words, Jon couldn't help but remember when he died after 18 years in a hospital bed. The funny thing was that humanity was afraid of death, but not of the pain that preceded it. Jon was the exact opposite. He feared the pain of living in agony every moment more than death itself. But that didn't stop him from fighting the disease for 18 long years. While other boys went to school, he stayed in the hospital, reading any book that would pass the time before the disease took away all movement. When death finally came for him, Jon only felt his body weaken and his senses gradually fade. In the end, only the purest darkness remained. He felt as if he were floating in a great sea as his consciousness gradually sank into it and disappeared. But everything changed in an instant. He felt a strong hand grab his, pulling him out of the darkness, and when his eyes opened again, there was a being in front of him. There was no way to describe the being that stood before him. If there was a word to describe it, he would say it was God. There was no other word, not even worthy, to describe the being in front of him. Opening his eyes and looking directly into the priestess' red eyes, Jon could see the expectant look in her eyes. He sat on a throne that was brighter than 1,000 suns. A red robe wrapped around his slender, gigantic body, and his hair, made of light, looked like a sea of twinkling stars falling down around him. His eyes, 2 red suns. Jon spoke in a calm tone, not realizing that he was now lying on the edge of the stream, earning the comfort of a pillow on Kinvara's lap. The woman's eyes had never been so bright, reflecting a deep, almost mad fanaticism. "Kinvara," Jon called out, snapping her out of whatever reverie she was in. He knew this was the right moment to influence her. The red faith must change to better serve the purposes of the Almighty. "My purposes, to be exact," Jon thought, keeping a calm expression on his face. "I am listening, Son of Light." Kinvara straightened her body, her voice sounding extremely serious and devout, as if he was waiting for something of great importance. "I will write a Bible with the stories told by R'hllor himself. They will teach life lessons, they will teach men respect, morality, and character." Jon began. "But before we can spread the faith of our God, we must change the image of the red faith in the eyes of the people of Westeros. Clothes, customs, prayers. And no blood magic, at least not in front of the commoners. And absolutely no sacrifices of the living on bonfires. Why did Christianity succeed in convincing so many people to convert? If you don't know the answer, I'll tell you: the Bible. Unlike other pagan religions that involved human sacrifice, immorality, sadism, and gore, the Bible was a book that told stories so real, holy, and instructive that it practically undermined the concept of religion in the world. Its stories inspired people to reflect on their mistakes and sins, and taught morals and ethics at a time when death and starvation were as common as breathing. In such an environment, everyone needed a spiritual pillar and embraced whatever seemed most sacred. John needed such a religion. He would be the Son of God in this world and bring peace to the world, which wasn't exactly a lie, but it definitely wasn't the whole truth. But truth was often changeable. Kinvara looked at John with extremely intense eyes, so intense that he might vanish from the face of the earth if her eyes had any power. Fortunately for John, she had no such power. When the entire transformation of the Red God's faith is complete, I will personally do something about it, including the clothing, customs, prayers, and idols to worship. You should expand as soon as possible. Ignoring the woman's increasingly fanatical gaze, if such a thing was possible, John spoke in a calm tone, his purple eyes fixed on the red eyes. Rising from her lap, John ignored her nakedness and held Kinvara's face with both hands, approaching her face and standing a dangerously close distance away, looking directly into her eyes. Don't disappoint me, Kinvara, I don't like mistakes. Anyone who interferes with the reforms must die, no matter who. You and the Red Faith will be my sharpest sword to pave the way in the coming long night. In front of those deep purple eyes, all Kinvara could feel was her chest bubbling with an infinite energy coursing through her body. She just wanted to run back to Volantis and start the reforms to make the Son of Light smile like any normal child. Turning away from him, Kinvara knelt in front of John, her body close to the ground, and kissed his feet with all the devotion and care she could muster. She wanted to convey all her respect, love, and devotion with the touch of her lips on his feet. Your decree is an order, Son of Light. All those who refused to follow the new commandments died burned by the holy flames of purification. Raising her head, Kinvara replied with a happy but equally mad tone, a look that sent shivers through John's body. Crazy. The woman was definitely mad. John thought, slightly startled by the look Kinvara gave him. Although he had wanted this look in her eyes with his earlier words, seeing it in person really brought a feeling of fear and caution to John. In that moment, John understood that in Kinvara's eyes he was no longer a man, but a god, her god, to be worshipped and devoted to. He had no doubt that if he asked her to die, Kinvara would do so with a smile on her face. Thank you, Kinvara. Your devotion will always be noticed by the Lord of Light. John lied without showing any reaction. The Omnipotent and Omniscient God had better things to do than to pay attention to a human, even if he was probably no more than one of the most important ants. Holding her face with his hand, John watched as the woman of hundreds of years closed her eyes and enjoyed the warmth of his hand on her cheek. A naked 6-year-old boy and a naked woman in a stream would surely frighten many people. Chapter 8: The Two Queens. If it weren't for these two women, I might not be the man I am today. Enar Targaryen, a year before the conquest, watching Rhaenys and Visenya Targaryen. At the nexus of space and time, John discovered that he could shape the place to his liking. So he transformed the entire nexus into the most important place in the Targaryen dynasty, the island that each heir to the Iron Throne would receive as a fief upon his coronation. Dragonstone. Home sweet home. Visenya commented as she looked at the huge black stone castle that stood on a hill on the stony island. The entire architecture of the castle had dragon-like aspects, as if it were a giant dragon in the shape of a castle. There were fierce statues of dragons and other creatures on the walls of Dragonstone. This made the whole castle not only terrifying, but especially majestic, making everyone feel awe and respect before such a monstrosity of stone, dragon fire, and ancient magic. The queen's lilac eyes turned to the boy walking beside her. 6 months had passed since she had taken over John's guardianship, and in that time she had seen a boy who had been quiet and strong, but without any princely aura, transform into someone worthy of the title of prince. A development that Visenya watched with satisfaction. In these 6 months she had grown fond of this future offspring. He was everything Aegon needed in a son, not only noble in character, but also talented in politics and a great warrior. Frankly, he was the son any king would want to succeed him. instead of the two extremes of Aegon's sons, her son and Rhaenys' son. One was too strong, the other too weak, both kings lacking what the other lacked most. But as a mother, she would support her son, right or wrong. I didn't ask, but to which noble house does Dragonstone currently belong? Visenya asked as she climbed the steps leading to the castle. His eyes scanned every part of the island with a strong yet nostalgic gaze. Stannis of House Baratheon, younger brother of King Robert Baratheon. Jon replied as he studied the massive castle with a curious gaze. It was the ancestral home of the Targaryen dynasty, but when Rhaella Targaryen abandoned it, she announced the end of the dynasty in Westeros. It all started and ended here. I must say it's a rather cruel irony of fate. Visenya muttered to herself, lost in thought. Tell me about this Stannis. Jon nodded and answered, Stannis is a complicated man. In addition to being a brilliant strategist, he's someone with a strong sense of duty and justice, so tenacious that you wonder how he can stay so focused. During the rebellion, he defended Storm's End for a year against Lord Mace Tyrell's forces, without men or food, eating whatever he could find. The only reason he didn't eat the dead was because the North had arrived and started fighting Reach's forces. Jon did not hide the admiration in his words for the man. Stannis was indeed a difficult enemy to fight. Fortunately, with a dragon and the ability to see into the future, Jon could ambush Stannis Baratheon at any time. It doesn't matter. In the face of the mightiest power in the world, even the most arrogant of kings must bow before us, or you in the future, Jon. Visenya commented with a piercing look, ruffling Jon's hair, which showed a helpless expression. Don't mess up my hair. Jon complained loudly, but Visenya continued to mess up his hair. Without realizing it, they were both standing in front of the huge gates, which were open as if inviting Visenya and Jon to enter. But whether it was Jon or Visenya, they both stopped and looked at the figure of a woman with silver and gold hair, waiting for them with a graceful, elegant smile on her lips. You are old, Visenya. She spoke with her hands behind her back as she flashed a mischievous smile. And you look very young, sister. Visenya replied with a strong, indifferent look. Eventually, seeing the gentle smile of the beautiful woman in front of her, Visenya's hard gaze softened slightly as she spoke in a softer tone. It is good to see you again, Rhaenys. Yes, the woman before Jon and Visenya was Rhaenys Targaryen, second wife of Aegon the Conqueror. Rhaenys gestured for them to enter and she walked beside her sister and the boy. I assume my sister knows why I'm here? Rhaenys asked with a naturally cheerful smile. It will be a long explanation. Visenya commented in a tone of amusement that surprised Jon and even more Visenya herself. It was indeed rare for the older sister to show amusement in normal times. If there's good wine and music, I don't mind the delay. Rhaenys replied with a confident tone. If there was wine and good music, she could entertain herself for days without caring. Visenya looked at Jon for an answer. Rhaenys followed her sister's gaze and focused on Jon, whose purple eyes flickered with a curious light as he watched the boy intently. Impossible. I've never tried wine, so I can't just make it appear. At most, water or juice. Jon replied, feeling a touch of helplessness as he saw the two women's eyes focused on him. He couldn't recreate something he had never experienced, even if the two women wanted him to. Never mind, a drink is always good. Rhaenys, though disappointed not to have wine, nodded and replied with a smile on her lips. Her eyes were still fixed on the beautiful child walking beside her older sister. The boy screamed his Valyrian ancestry from head to toe and possessed a princely aura, though he walked and acted like a commoner. Ignoring the gaze of the second queen of Westeros, Jon followed the two women as they gazed curiously down the corridors of Dragonstone. By Valyrian, how could our family be so foolish as to lose our greatest weapons? It's a miracle the dynasty has lasted nearly 200 years without dragons. Rhaenys let out a groan of frustration as she held her head in denial. The news of her death wasn't as devastating as she had expected. In fact, she took it in stride. After all, it was perfectly normal to be dead after being crushed by Meraxes, her dragon. But the news that the Targaryen dynasty had fallen shook her to the core. Whether it was her or Visenya, they had both come to this continent to save the world according to Aegon, but knowing that they had failed despite all the effort, sweat, and blood they had shed really brought a huge sense of despondency to the naturally cheerful woman. Besides, Visenya, you taught the heir of our noble house to act like a bloody barbarian warrior who only knows how to command armies. Rhaenys looked at her older sister with a discontented expression. The very thought of a fool who only knew how to swing a sword being in charge of the fate of the world gave her a headache. Visenya didn't like being scolded by her younger sister at all. Jon doesn't need me to teach him other things, the boy is smarter than 40-year-old Aegon, she said, obviously prouder of Jon than he was of himself. Rhaenys snorted coldly and looked at Jon with disdain. He behaves like a commoner, his posture is not upright enough, he holds a cup as if it were a glass of cheap ale, he does not express confidence in his movements, he does not project strength when he walks, his hair is not perfectly combed, he dresses like a filthy savage. Jon was extremely embarrassed to hear such a long list of faults. He had never imagined there were so many, he had always thought it was normal to act like this, but he soon realized that these were things he had carried over from his past life into the present. But when you think about it, it was normal for him to have so many flaws in Rhaenys' eyes because Jon was never someone powerful in his past life. He was just a sickly 18-year-old boy with extraordinary resilience and willpower who spent most of his life in bed. So, despite his current status, it was quite normal for him to have so many flaws. Visenya frowned when she heard that, but when she looked at Jon she did see the flaws Rhaenys mentioned, although the hair thing was her fault. Thinking back, she also realized that she had only taught Jon how to hold a sword, how to use blood magic, how to ride a dragon and how to command armies. No more and no less. Maybe that's why his mind wanted Rhaenys as much as he needed someone to teach him. Will Aegon be next? Visenya thought, raising the goblet of juice to her lips. Don't worry, my good son, I will make you a worthy monarch and teach you about politics and conspiracies. If I let Visenya teach you, you'll be a fool who thinks only of solving everything with dragons and steel. Rhaenys looked at Jon and spoke in a soft but amused tone. The idea of teaching Jon really made her happy. Even though it was true, Visenya couldn't help but frown when she heard Rhaenys' subtle sarcasm. Coldly snorting, she looked at her sister with dissatisfaction but remained silent. With Rhaenys' help, Jon could get a better education, at least in the subjects his younger sister mentioned. Chapter 9 The Two Queens 2. Hope. A terrible weapon capable of bringing down entire dynasties and empires, and I hold it in my hands. Aenar Targaryen said, looking into the future he wanted. Several days had passed in the nexus of space and time. Jon's lessons began to intensify with time. Jon and Rhaenys were face-to-face resting after a session of etiquette lessons. They both sat on chairs around a table on the window balcony. Visenya was nearby, a glass of juice in one hand, looking out at the turbulent waves of the Black Sea below. Jon, I've never asked, but why do you prefer to be called Jon when your real name is Aenar? Rhaenys asked casually, her gaze expressing obvious boredom. For someone who appreciated music as much as she did, sitting still was terribly monotonous. The only fun she had was teaching Jon, but even that could be exhausting after a while. Jon, who was about to raise his glass of juice to his lips, stopped and looked at the beautiful woman in front of him. He lowered his glass and put it back on the table. Smiling, he replied in a calm and collected tone, "Because I want to enjoy it while I still have the right to be an ordinary human being." Jon's answer caused Rhaenys and Visenya to look at the 6-year-old with astonished and disbelieving expressions. Ignoring their looks, Jon continued. "Being just Jon Snow is freeing. I can go where I want or do what I want without anyone caring. A luxury Aenar Targaryen will not have, he will be a god in the eyes of the people." "What are you going to do to make everyone see you as a god?" Visenya asked, frowning with a worried look on her face. She had grown fond of the boy months ago, almost considering him a son. Knowing the cruel fate that awaited Jon didn't please her at all. Yes, in her eyes, being considered a god was not a blessing, but a curse and a burden that no man should ever have to carry. "I will give you hope," Jon replied, looking out to sea with a distracted and distant air. The wind gently ruffled his hair, while his purple eyes radiated a warm, gentle warmth. "As simple as that?" Rhaenys asked, her voice more serious than ever. "Simple? Giving hope is not as easy as it sounds, Queen Rhaenys." Jon looked at Rhaenys and smiled. "I will give you a god to worship, I will be your Messiah, and I will bring salvation to this world. The future I see will be the future they believe in. They will fight to spread my name among other peoples, bringing death and chaos wherever they go. An army of fanatics, ready to do whatever I command, simply because they believe my words contain the ultimate truth of the world." Jon's words made the two women completely silent. They looked at the 6-year-old and instead of seeing a child, they saw a man who carried an even heavier burden than their own husband who was tormented by prophetic visions in his dreams. "Why don't you run away? Let the world burn and don't care, just be happy." Rhaenys couldn't help but comment with a complex look. She looked at the beautiful child before her and let out a sigh of regret. "Why can't I run away? It would only cause more terrible things to happen. So instead of swimming against the current, it's better to let the water take you." Jon replied, his smile never fading. He was happy and relaxed. The reason for this was simple. Having someone to listen to his fears, plans or worries was something surprisingly pleasant and unexpectedly able to bring him peace. Perhaps this was the magical power of the psychologists in his past life. In the real world he could never say such things to any of his family. They would all call him crazy and never believe him, but whether it was Rhaenys or Visenya, both of whom were Aegon's queens, someone who was also plagued by prophetic dreams, they understood perfectly the weight, pain and exhaustion he carried on his shoulders. "I wish you luck, Jon Snow." Rhaenys spoke, her tone full of pity and regret for the terrible future that awaited her descendant. "Don't worry, the winds of the future are in my favor. I just have to sail the silver waters of fate to reach the promised land." Jon looked at the two women pitifully and replied in a simple but extremely confident tone. 6 months later. North Wolfwood Forest. Jon looked at the snow covering the forest and couldn't help but admire the flawless color of the snow. Beside him stood the huge head of Caraxes, the heat emanating from the beast melting the snow and making the air seem warm, even though it was at temperatures that would kill a human in minutes. There was no sign of Kinvara or any of the Red God's followers at the scene, all but one of whom had returned to Essos on his orders. Kinvara, in particular, had clear orders. Reform the entire Church of the Red God, change absolutely everything. At the same time, Kinvara was carrying a Bible that Jon had written for her during their months together. The Bible was different from the Bible anyone knew. The whole context had been changed to suit Essos and Westeros, especially the names, but all went well and the world's first Bible was born. Jon could see through the prescience. Kinvara was spreading his will to the masses. In the next few years the Red Faith would see an explosive jump in the number of believers. Even the fiery hand will change according to Jon, as 1,000 men was far from what he wanted. The Red Army will be Jon's main army, fanatical warriors, extremely loyal to only one person, himself. They will be his sword and shield. Jon wouldn't leave the priestesses without work either. How could he do that? So on his orders Kinvara will create a new order of women for him, the Emperor's daughters. They would be his shadows and spies. "Caraxes, my uncle will be back in 2 weeks. I need to get back to Winterfell." Jon leaned his body against Caraxes and spoke in High Valyrian. The Crimson Dragon snorted with obvious displeasure at his actions, clearly not liking the idea of being away from Jon for too long. Jon didn't like the feeling of separation either, especially with Caraxes. He was his brother, they should be together, protecting each other. Unfortunately, duty took precedence over feelings. "Don't worry, as my powers mature I'll visit you more often in the future." Stroking the red scales, Jon commented with a happy tone. He wasn't lying. As his powers matured, he would be able to visit Caraxes much more easily. Jon's words seemed to calm the disgruntled mood of the red beast, who stood calmly around his rider, fearing that the cold might somehow affect him. Jon noticed his movements and simply smiled, the concern, though irrelevant to him, showing the bond Caraxes had with him. Touching the meteorite steel sword named Lady Lya after his mother, even in the depths of Wolfwood, Jon felt surrounded by kin. Rising from the snowy ground, Jon looked at Caraxes with a calm gaze and spoke. "I'm coming, remember to fly only at night and no flying during the day." Even if the others didn't believe the rumors and thought they were just drunken ravings, one could never be too careful. He didn't want too many people to see Caraxes. A high frequency might alert a certain spider in the Red Keep. The dragon looked at Jon and closed his eyes, completely ignoring his presence. Apparently it was still unhappy about being separated from its rider. Jon smiled and took one last look at his brother, blood and race aside, and made his way back to Winterfell. As he walked through the bushes and trees, Jon couldn't help but think that this journey had brought many things, some he hadn't expected and others he had. But to him, the unexpected was sometimes more attractive than anything else in the world. After all, mystery had always fascinated all beings, and he was no different. Looking back, John could no longer see the clearing that Caraxes had called home. There were only trees and more trees. It was easy to get lost in this natural labyrinth of nature. With a sigh, he walked deeper into the forest with a determined look on his face. He would return to Winterfell and begin preparations for his conquest. The wheel of fate began to turn, and with it came a change this planet had never seen since its beginnings. Chapter 10: The Wolf and the Dragon Eye. How many friends are you sure are your friends? I have one, and I trust him with my life without a care in the world. Enar Targaryen, thinking of Robb Stark. After 6 days of traveling, Jon finally returned to Winterfell. The old castle was simply gigantic, the size of 5 or 6 football fields. There were ruins dating back 8,000 years and new structures that had survived millennia of renovations by the Winter Kings. Without dragons, conquering Winterfell was harder than opening the legs of a septan loyal to the Seven and having sex with her. Of course, no castle was impenetrable. If there were traitors, no matter how strong the castle, it would fall to the treachery of others within. Jon had no trouble entering Winterfell. Even though he was a bastard in everyone's eyes, he was the bastard of Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Lord Paramount of the North. The guards would never stop him from entering Winterfell, especially with the news of the Crown's victory over House Greyjoy's rebellion. That meant Eddard Stark was returning to Winterfell, and everyone knew how much the Lord of Winterfell loved his bastard. Upon entering Winterfell, the first thing Jon noticed was the warmth of the hot springs beneath the castle that dispelled the deadly cold of the north, and the second was the atmosphere of the place. Unlike 6 months ago, the atmosphere, which had been filled with the tension and excitement of war, was now calmer, though he was even more excited about the Lord of Winterfell's victory. Lady Lya was in her sheath at his waist, making it impossible for anyone to see the precious sword. Jon had no intention of revealing it anytime soon. He would take advantage of it and begin to divinize his name to the people of the north when he was 10. Jon walked towards the inner part of the castle, ignoring the surprised looks of the servants, and continued towards his room, or rather the storeroom he called his room. Arriving there, he was surprised to find it clean and tidy, unlike what he had expected. "Looks like Robb helped me out again," Jon muttered to himself, trying to guess who had ordered his room cleaned. In the whole of the north, only Eddard and Robb could do such a thing. Since his uncle had not yet returned from the war, he knew it was Robb who had ordered his room cleaned. Leaving his things on the bed, Jon heard footsteps approaching quickly, and without looking back he could guess who was coming. The eldest son of House Stark, Robb Stark. And just as Jon had suspected, Robb appeared at the bedroom door with a slightly sweaty face after running to his room for some time. Seeing Jon packing his things, Robb put a broad smile on his face and quickly entered the room, checking his body for any sign of injury. "By the old gods, Jon, I thought you were dead," Robb said, his voice tinged with anger, but with an enormous sense of concern and relief for his well-being. Jon smiled and said, "I'm not going to die before you, Robb." Robb rolled his eyes and said with a false look of anger, "Are you cursing me to die before you? As I, a mere bastard, dare to curse the great heir of Winterfell?" Jon replied with a smile on his lips. Robb sighed and hugged Jon. "It's good to see you again, brother." "I say the same, brother." Jon hugged him back and spoke in a different tone. "It's good to see this stupid face again." When they parted, they both looked at each other and laughed. "Where have you been?" Robb asked, sitting down on Jon's bed, his blue eyes sparkling at the thought of the adventures his brother had been on in the last 6 moons. "I lived in Wolfwood for 6 moons, ran away from some bears, hunted rabbits, and slept looking at the stars," Jon replied, noticing the expression on Robb's face. He knew very well that Robb, like any 6-year-old, wanted to venture out into the world as he had done before. Robb's eyes showed shock and envy as he listened to Jon's experiences, especially his escape from the giant bear. He was probably 10 feet tall, and his brown fur could warm at least 5 people on a cold night. He could knock down a tree with one swipe of his paw. It was incredible. Even though he was exaggerating a bit, seeing the look of admiration and envy on Robb's face made Jon's heart swell with pride. "I wish I could have been there," Robb muttered to himself, his voice tinged with envy. "You know that's impossible. You're going to be Lord of Winterfell and future Lord Paramount of the North," Jon said, shaking his head. The chances of Robb being allowed to do something so dangerous were slim to none. Either Eddard or Catelyn would never allow him to be in danger. Robb knew this and showed a look of sadness. He let out a sigh as he thought of his future responsibilities. Jon, do you think I will be a good lord? Will my people survive the cold? Will they have food to fill their stomachs? He asked in a slightly tense and confused tone. What nonsense you're talking, of course you will be a good lord, but for that you have to learn and learn without rest. Only someone with knowledge can wield the full power of a lord paramount. Jon didn't hesitate to answer Robb. He thought it was normal for the 6-year-old to doubt his own future. Many adults had doubts about themselves, let alone a 6-year-old boy being taught the art of government and battle. Robb gained confidence as he listened to his brother's words and smiled brightly. You should be Lord of Winterfell. You always do better than me in Maester Luwin's tests, not to mention your fencing lessons with the old Master of Arms, Roderick Castle. Jon's lips twitched at the boy's bold words. He looked at Robb and said, rolling his eyes, When your mother hears that, she'll want my tongue and maybe my head. Robb pondered Jon's words for a moment and nodded in agreement. You're right, I can even imagine the look on her face. Her cheeks flushed and her eyes wide with rage. He said, trying to imitate the expression his mother would probably make. Jon started to laugh, imagining the angry red fish, and Robb joined in. They looked at each other and left the room together, laughing. Just as they were about to head for the training grounds, they were stopped by Ser Roderick Castle, Master at Arms of Winterfell. Lady Stark has requested your presence in the Great Hall, Snow. Though Roderick showed no dislike for Jon's bastard status, he also showed no goodwill. Jon raised an eyebrow, shrugged, and headed for the Great Hall. Robb showed a worried expression and followed Jon side by side. He promised himself he wouldn't let his mother do anything to Jon. Arriving at the Great Hall, which could easily seat 500 men, Jon looked up at the highest seat and saw Lady Catelyn Stark, born Tully, sitting on the throne of the former kings of Winter with elegance and arrogance on her face. In her arms, Sansa, just over a year old, gazed curiously at Jon with her whole hand stuffed in her mouth. The baby's sweet, adorable eyes were one of the most unbelievably adorable things Jon had ever seen. He wanted to squeeze those adorable cheeks, but put it aside when he felt Catelyn's gaze on him. So arrogant, sitting on it like it's her throne. Who would have thought that just by spreading her legs and giving birth to an heir, she could sit on such an important and historic throne? It's like they say, a man can conquer the world, but a woman conquers a man's heart. Jon thought as he saw the veiled arrogance on Catelyn's face. He knew that she had prayed to the gods for death to take him again, and was not at all surprised to see her expression full of disgust and anger towards him. Jon didn't know if there was a more venomous woman in the world, but Catelyn was definitely in the top 3. Lady Stark, your beauty graces my eyes with praise. I hope you are well and happy. Jon bowed to Catelyn and spoke words of admiration and respect, but anyone could see from his expression that his respect was just empty, meaningless words. Robb wanted to laugh at Jon's bored expression, but he held himself back when he saw the look of anger on his mother's face. I see you're safe, bastard. Catelyn spoke with no shame in her words. Without Eddard to control her temper, she revealed her ruthless, venomous nature. Yes, I'm alive, but not because you prayed for my safety, my lady. Jon replied with a look of indifference. Catelyn may have seemed strong at the moment, but she really wasn't. She was only responsible for keeping Winterfell in order. It was foolish to give control of Winterfell to a woman who had never had any military training. It was the Master at Arms of Winterfell himself, Ser Roderick Castle, who was in charge. The moment Eddard Stark returned to Winterfell, Catelyn would become just another powerless woman in this world, like so many others. As for her anger at that moment, Jon didn't care. He would disobey her orders without hesitation. His oath was to Eddard Stark and Robb Stark. Chapter 11, The Wolf and the Dragon 2. Anger can turn you into an animal, especially when you have a weapon in your hand. Aenar Targaryen controlling his anger. As the bastard looked at her without fear, his purple eyes staring back at her, reminding her of her husband's infidelity, Catelyn clenched her fists tightly, a rage bubbling in her chest. She hated that she couldn't do anything about him, that her prayers weren't answered, that even if she fasted for days, the bastard was healthier than a young, strong horse. Catelyn took a deep breath, unable to hide the disgust in her voice. You can go back, I don't want to see your face. The air stinks of sin when you're around. Jon didn't hesitate to taunt Catelyn again, not hiding the sarcasm directed at her. The smell of sin you smell has a different origin, it smells like fish. Before Jon could continue, Robb's expression changed and he dragged his brother out of the great hall as he heard the sound of something breaking behind him. It was obvious his mother had thrown something against the wall. This left the 6-year-old with a helpless look on his face. On one side was his mother, on the other his brother. He didn't want to take sides so as not to hurt either of them, but the more he did, the more Robb realized that it was making their relationship worse. Jon didn't mind talking to Catelyn, but Catelyn hated that her son was on Jon's side. This gave the boy a huge headache. "Why do you always have to annoy her?" he asked, looking at Jon with a helpless expression. Noticing this, Jon put his arm around Robb's neck and spoke with a smile. "Do not hesitate to side with your mother, Robb. She's cruel to me, but she's a mother who truly cares for her children." Unlike Catelyn, Jon was not childish enough to make his son stay in a difficult situation. It was normal for a son to stand by his mother. How could he be angry or resentful about something so natural? Looking at Jon, Robb suppressed the emotion in his chest and also smiled brightly. "Let's go to training camp. I want that smile off your face, brother." "Keep dreaming, Robb. It's you who will be face down in the dirt." Jon replied with a smile that was confident to say the least. It wasn't that he was arrogant, but when you can predict your opponent's every move, it's not that difficult to defeat and kill him. About 2 weeks later, the gates of Winterfell were opened and all the lords of the north entered House Stark Castle with their heads held high and their smiles wide. Riding a majestic black horse, Eddard Stark could be seen leading all the lords with a calm, silent expression. This earned Eddard the title of the Silent Wolf, for he could kill men in complete silence, reminiscent of the actions of a wolf stalking its prey. Surprisingly, he was accompanied by a brown-haired, blue-eyed boy dressed in brown leather with a golden octopus crest. Eddard's entire family stood at the entrance to Winterfell, all patiently awaiting the arrival of the most powerful man in the north. As Eddard dismounted, he grabbed Theon by the armpits and lowered the 10-year-old to the ground. "Welcome back, my lord. I've prayed every night for your safe return." Catelyn, holding Sansa in her arms, approached and greeted her husband as a virtuous wife should. The hard look in the Lord Paramount's grey eyes seemed to soften at the sight of his wife and daughter. He kissed his wife first, a chaste but deep kiss. Then he kissed the red-haired baby's forehead and a small smile appeared on his lips. "Thank you for your prayers, my wife." "Ha ha ha ha. Lord Stark can hardly wait to share a bed with his wife." "Don't worry, Lord Stark. We can wait for you to relieve yourself." The northern lords, seeing their liege lord's actions, applauded and spoke vulgar words, oblivious to their surroundings. Everyone looked normal, no one cared how vulgar their words were, as it made the atmosphere of victory after an important war even happier at that moment. "Looks like you're going to have another sister soon, Robb," Jon commented with a mischievous grin, seeing the embarrassed look on the young man's face. Which was only natural since everyone was talking about the boy's mother. "Shut up, Jon." At the mischievous smile on Jon's lips, Robb practically growled with the embarrassment he felt at the moment. Although it seemed a bit shocking for a 6-year-old boy to know about sex, given Robb's identity, he had learned about men's and women's issues a year ago. This also showed how early boys and girls were considered men and women in this world. For women, they were already considered women when they had their first menarche, while for boys it was even earlier, as they were considered men when they managed to consummate their marriage. However, in this happy atmosphere, filled with the glory of a landslide victory for the crown, there was only one person who wasn't happy to hear the extremely vulgar words of the northern lords. Catelyn, like any lady from an important family in the south, had been brought up in what was considered a more civilized environment, and when she came into contact with what she herself considered barbaric, she naturally felt an enormous contempt for the ways of the north and its strange and terrifying gods. Although she had been married to Eddard for 6 years, the woman had not, and perhaps never would, adapt to the older and more direct ways of the north. For this reason, she felt great anger and embarrassment as she listened to the vulgar and coarse words of the northern lords. However, as someone with a modicum of intelligence, she knew she could never say anything that would bring dishonor to House Stark, for her words, her actions, could implicate Robb. Truth be told, Catelyn was lucky to have a husband in Eddard, who, though a full-blooded northerner, was brought up in the Vale under the tutelage of Jon Arryn, so Eddard himself was more open to her and her southern ways. Had she married Brandon Stark, she certainly wouldn't have been able to build a septon of the faith of the Seven in the heart of the north. If Rickard Stark, Eddard's father, were alive, he would probably have slapped his son's wife's face for doing something so insulting to the north and House Stark. So Catelyn was definitely lucky to be married to Eddard and not another Stark. Not knowing what his wife was Thinking, Eddard looked at his two boys not far away. Both boys were bigger than he remembered, especially Jon. The boy was about 6, but he was taller than any 10-year-old. But the change in his posture and presence took the Lord Paramount completely by surprise. As far as he could remember, he looked more like a prince than Joffrey Baratheon himself. There was no comparison between the two. Joffrey, despite his princely status, was just a spoiled, arrogant boy. He hadn't even begun his education, let alone his studies. Jon, on the other hand, had an aura about him that made people look at him. He was a regal presence in the place, making it impossible for anyone to ignore him. His deep purple eyes began to show a power that made it impossible to look him in the eye. Incredible as it may seem, Eddard sensed that he was facing a growing king, which left the Lord of Winterfell utterly bewildered by the most drastic change in his nephew, whom he had raised as his own flesh and blood, knowing full well that his honor was tarnished and his marriage strained. "Dad." Robb greeted his father, trying to look as mature as possible, which soon became difficult as he began to smile when he saw his father's eyes on him. "I hope you haven't neglected your studies and training, Robb." Eddard stroked his son's copper hair and spoke in his deep, gentle voice. A kindness only his family could have. "I have trained hard. It won't be long before I can hunt a bear." Robb puffed out his chest, trying to look bigger and more manly as he spoke his ambition, causing all the northern lords to laugh at the boldness and courage of their future liege. "Ha ha ha. The boy's definitely a Stark. He wants to fight a bear at the age of 6. Young lord, you better train for a few more years so you don't become bear food." "Ha ha ha ha." The lords of the north spoke as they laughed at Robb. They didn't despise Robb's childish courage, on the contrary, they all looked at him with an appreciative look in their eyes. Eddard also looked at his son with a look of satisfaction. Though he would never have allowed Robb to run into such danger, he appreciated his son's courage. Eddard's eyes fell on Jon, but apart from a nod, the Lord Paramount of the North entered the castle with his entire retinue. Jon didn't follow his uncle into the great hall and went back to his room. As for Eddard's actions, they didn't bother him at all. He wasn't a child desperate for paternal affection. Chapter 12, The Wolf and the Dragon 3. Duty and love seldom go together. But for a ruler, duty must always come before sentiment. Enar Targaryen thought as he looked at the impassive expression on Lord Stark of Winterfell, a man who had chosen duty over the love of a woman. Eddard watched with a blank expression as his nephew walked through the door of his manor. The boy was taller, even taller than Robb, not at all like a 6-year-old. He also noticed that he was carrying a sword at his waist, even though he was much taller than the boy. At the same time, the boy's beauty had begun to blossom, his face becoming more and more like the man he hated with all his might. "Jon." Though he didn't mean to, Eddard found his voice harsher and more intimidating than he had intended. "Lord Stark." He replied with a calm expression, his purple eyes staring at him with a quiet intensity. A look that reminded him of an enormous beast. The boy had never called him father, no matter how many times he had told him to. As stubborn as his mother. He definitely inherited that trait from Lyanna. "I hear you've been away from Winterfell for 6 months. Eddard spoke again, his voice even more stern and angry than before. The thought of Jon being gone for 6 months made him want to strangle his guards. If anything happened to his nephew, he wouldn't have the heart to look at his sister when he died. Wolfwood, to be exact. Jon replied with a calm, even bored expression. Something that seemed to irritate the Lord of Winterfell completely. "You treat my concern as nothing?" he asked in a calm voice, but anyone could see that behind the impassive exterior he was completely enraged. 6 months. He could have been in any town, but he was in Wolfwood. Even he, a grown man, wouldn't dare spend 6 months in this forest infested with beasts and wolves. Even the most experienced hunters in Wintertown couldn't claim to have spent 6 months in Wolfwood. Eddard took a deep breath and tried to control himself, not to grab a belt and start beating Jon to teach him not to take unnecessary risks. Jon remained indifferent to his uncle's words, which were comforting, but he had no intention of letting himself be forced to flee. "I think Lord Stark knows why I chose to risk becoming bear food rather than stay in Winterfell. If he were a normal child, he would probably be working in the cold for the next 6 months on Catelyn's orders. Whether he would survive or not, he didn't know, but it would certainly not be a pleasant experience for him." Eddard seemed to show a brief expression of helplessness and loneliness at Jon's words. "Catelyn would never hurt you, Jon. You're just a child." he said, slumping helplessly in his chair, the look on the Lord Paramount of the North's face making one wonder what could possibly make one of the most powerful men on the continent show such a look. Jon seemed to hear the funniest joke of his life. He looked at Eddard and said sarcastically, not hiding his dislike for the red-headed fish his uncle shared his bed with every night. "Do you hear what you're saying, Lord Stark? She prays to her southern gods for my death every day, she makes me work in the bitter cold to make me sick, and the food I earn is less every day than the day before. The servants who want to get into Lady Stark's good graces turn me against her, thinking they will be generously rewarded. Tell me, Lord Paramount of the North, do you really believe what you've just said?" Jon's every word was like a sword through Eddard's heart, and he was furious as he listened to his nephew's experience. Crash! Eddard had slammed his fist down on his desk, the man's face showing nothing but the purest rage one could feel. "Why didn't you tell me?" His words came from between his tightly clenched teeth and his jaw, which was marked by a strong tension. "Tell you? And what good would that do except to make people look at me with even more contempt and caution, all of them afraid that a mere child might have the power to influence the great and majestic Lord of the North?" Jon replied, not hiding the irony of his situation. He was probably the most powerful man in the world, not only because of Caraxes but also because of his ability to foresee. But here he was, in the eyes of the world, a mere bastard from the North, powerless and stigmatized by everyone for a status that never belonged to him. He looked at the boy who, despite his situation, had an indifferent expression on his face. Eddard felt ashamed for not knowing something so important, ashamed for not keeping his promise to his sister, and even more ashamed that his own wife had brought such shame upon him. "Lord Stark, I'm going to give you some advice. You can ignore it or take it, I don't care." Seeing the look of guilt and anger on the man's face, Jon spoke in a calm, indifferent tone. It took a lot to make him feel anger, fear, or any kind of dread. Eddard looked at his nephew and waited in silence for his words. "I advise you to bring Robb and your future children up in the ways of the North. Many lords have been angered by the fact that their lord's wife was a southerner who worshipped other gods. Especially after the construction of the church in the center of Winterfell. If this continues, you may hear many whispers that Lord Stark can't tame his own wife." He spoke, his voice filled with genuine concern for Robb's situation. He wasn't lying. Robb and Catelyn's popularity in the North was negative to say the least, not to mention the fact that his wife had never accepted the ways of the North. If Robb and the other sons of Eddard who were to come were brought up in the ways of the North, many complications could be avoided. Eddard's brow furrowed as he heard this, but he didn't speak, pondering his nephew's words. He knew Jon was right. His wife was not well liked by the lords of the North, especially the powerful ones, who indirectly offered him their daughters to be the new Lady Stark. To divorce Catelyn would not only stain her honor, it would also make mortal enemies of House Tully. How he could do such a thing, it didn't matter if the North was untouchable without dragons, but having too many enemies was certainly not a good thing. With a sigh, Eddard looked at his nephew with an unreadable expression. Though he'd always known his nephew to be intelligent, Jon's previous words could not be described as simply intelligent. He was political and closed, almost like the nobles of the South who were used to plotting all day in their castles. This made him feel even worse. Jon's maturity in his eyes was only because he was forced to mature early. Something his wife made sure of with the poor boy. With that in mind, Eddard looked at the boy and spoke with an unquestioning tone. "This will never happen to you again, Jon. I promise you on my honor as your father and Lord of Winterfell." Jon looked at Eddard in surprise, not expecting the man to say something so incredible and swear on his honor. It was hard for a man in such a backward world to care enough about someone to fight against his own wife. Though he didn't mean to, his lips curved into an almost imperceptible smile. Though he hid it well, Eddard caught a brief glimpse of the smile and it brought a sense of relief to his mind. The whole tense atmosphere became much lighter at that moment. Eddard looked at his nephew and stared curiously at the sword in its scabbard at his waist. "Jon, where did you get this sword?" Eddard asked with a touch of curiosity and confusion. He didn't remember seeing such a sword in Winterfell, and from the grip of the sword and the rubies on it, it was a real steel sword and very expensive. Something a child should not be handling at such a tender age. "In the 6 months I spent in Wolfwood, I was chased by a bear one day. Luckily I was small and quick enough to escape through the trees and came across a cave." Jon told the lie he had planned in case his uncle questioned him. Eddard's face showed an expression of displeasure at the thought of his nephew being chased by a bear, but he remained silent, waiting for his next words. "There was a sword in the cave, I took it out and it's been with me for months." Jon finished his words, looking at Eddard with a look of pride that any child would have when faced with such a thing. At his words, Jon drew the sword from its sheath with a piercing sound, revealing its beautiful milky sheen to the world. Eddard's face changed dramatically at the sight of the blade. He couldn't help but remember the sword that had almost taken his life 6 years ago. The legendary sword of House Dane Dawn. Rising from his chair, Eddard quickly made his way to Jon's side. He looked at the sword and couldn't think of any noble house, great or small, that had a sword forged from a star in the sky. With a sigh, Eddard looked at Jon with a worried expression. It was as if fate wanted Jon to be extraordinary, even if he tried to make the boy seem ordinary to everyone. "Until you grow up, don't show that sword to anyone," Eddard warned in a serious tone, looking straight into his nephew's purple eyes. At the same time, the Lord of Winterfell was proud that Jon had obtained this sword, showing that he was exceptional, which wasn't surprising considering he was his sister's son by the Silver Prince. "What's the name of the sword?" Eddard asked curiously. Since Jon had found the sword, it was only natural that he should name it himself. "Lady Lya," Jon replied with a smile. "In honor of Lord Stark's sister." The smile on Eddard's face stiffened at the name of the sword. He felt his heart beat extremely fast and an impossible possibility appeared in his mind. He knows. He knows. He knows. He searched his nephew's face for any expression and was relieved to know that Jon had only wanted to honor Lyanna for her behavior, as he had heard from Benjen. Jon almost laughed when he saw the tense, panicked look on the great Eddard Stark's face. It was just as he thought. It was really amusing to see his expression when he spoke the name of the sword. "It's a good name. Lya would be proud of you, Jon, for honoring her like that." Stroking the boy's hair, Eddard spoke with a rare gentleness and reminiscence in his gaze. Jon didn't speak, looking down at the sword in his hand with a slightly emotional expression. Chapter 13, The Princess of Vengeance. Deep within the human unconscious there is a penetrating need for a logical universe that makes sense. But the real universe is always one step beyond logic. Enar Targaryen, observing how anger, hatred and resentment could change a person. Dorne Sunspear. Old Palace. POV, Rhaenys Targaryen, Princess of Vengeance. Opening her eyes, Rhaenys woke up in her bed, startled. Her naked body under Myr's thin silk sheet was completely drenched in sweat while the look of anger, hatred and resentment could still be seen in her eyes, like two flames capable of reducing anything to ashes. She looked away and saw through the window that the moon was still high in the night sky. Feeling the sticky sweat on her body, she got out of bed completely naked and put on a yellow robe. Pouring herself a glass of wine, she sat in the chair and watched the Sunspear landscape through the balcony. Another bloody nightmare, she muttered to herself, looking up at the pale moon, bringing the glass of wine to her lips and sipping the sweet liquid without any hesitation. It wasn't the first time, nor would it be the last, that she would have nightmares about that night that had cost her everything. Her mother, her brother and finally her father. All dead within a period of months, 2 of whom died in front of her. She would have died too if she hadn't hidden behind the door and escaped when the monsters entered the Queen's chambers. After escaping, she found Ser Jaime and with his help, managed to hide until her uncle came to King's Landing and took her away from the royal capital. But before she fled, she saw with her own eyes her playmate brought from Dorne being dragged out from under her bed by the heel and brutally killed like an animal. Her brother, who was just an adorable baby, his face destroyed against the wall, turning into a mass of blood, bones and brain tissue against the wall. Her mother, raped and broken in half in front of her. She could hear the screams of pain and wailing as the monster penetrated her, oblivious to her mother's cries and wails. Even though she was only 3 years old, she couldn't forget that scene and the hatred grew stronger and stronger as the years went by, the thirst for revenge practically becoming her only goal in life. The throne no longer mattered to her, she only wanted the murderers of her family. Drinking all the wine from the goblet and even more from the jug, 9-year-old Rhaenys drank all the wine she had and didn't even get momentarily drunk. More specifically, even if she drank barrels of wine she couldn't get drunk, something she tried. However, even though she couldn't get drunk, the wine still helped to relax her chaotic mood, even on a night of nightmares which were all her nights. Staring at the empty glass, Rhaenys couldn't help remembering the dream she'd had 2 days ago, a dream she hadn't had for a long time, although it was a strange one. She was dreaming of a boy obviously of ancient Valyrian descent with his white gold hair and purple eyes. He was smaller than her, but he emanated an aura that even her uncle Doran, the ruler of Dorne, did not possess. However, the thing that was most striking was his face, a face that resembled her father. Although childlike, she could recognize her father's features in the child's face. The other thing that caught her eye was the obvious discontent on his face, looking at her. "Stop invading my dreams, you cheeky sand dragon," he said, and before she could say anything, she found herself thrown out of the dream, waking up in the next second. For some reason, his displeased expression made Rhaenys feel funny, and a feeling of joy, which hadn't appeared in her life for many years, welled up in her chest again. Remembering the dream, Rhaenys' lips curved into an amused smile. Even though she knew it was just a dream that her mind had made up to make her feel better, she still enjoyed it very much. It was as if she had a little brother to torment like a real big sister. Staring at the moon, the Princess of Vengeance began to feel sleepy again, and without realizing it, the realm of dreams appeared before her once more. Rhaenys looked to the side and found herself in front of a huge field of blue flowers, winter roses, a rarity in the south of Westeros, but common in the vast, icy and inhospitable lands of the north. "You again." Hearing the childish male voice behind her, Rhaenys turned and saw the same boy as before, looking at her with a displeased expression. Seeing that expression on such an adorable face made Rhaenys laugh, something she hadn't done for a long time. Feeling rebellious in front of the boy, she replied arrogantly, "I'll go wherever I want, that's my dream." "Humph." The boy snorted loudly and spoke with a tone of sarcasm. "I think you're wrong about something. This isn't your dream, it's my dream, you cheeky, invading sand dragon." Rhaenys replied immediately, "I'm proudly a dragon." Her voice filled with pride in her Targaryen heritage. "I know you're a dragon, otherwise you wouldn't be able to enter my dream." The boy rolled his eyes and looked at her with contempt, as if he were looking at someone with a mental disability. A look that deeply irritated the Targaryen princess. "You insolent brat." Without hesitation, Rhaenys jumped on top of he, knocking them both into the field of winter roses. "I'll teach you to respect a dragon." "Just you?" Although pressed by her, the boy again showed a look of contempt, and they both began to fight at that moment, rolling around in the winter roses while exchanging insults considered innocent by many. After some unknown time, Rhaenys fell backwards into the sea of flowers and breathed heavily. She looked over and saw the boy in the same exhausted state as her. Between quick breaths she spoke. "I won." The boy looked at her with a superior gaze and answered while catching his breath. "I let you win, you cheeky dragon." Rhaenys raised an eyebrow and snorted amusedly at the stubborn expression. "I'm not in a dream, am I?" After a moment in silence, Rhaenys spoke again. She asked with a calm tone, her lilac eyes staring into the purple eyes of the boy next to her. "I told you before, this isn't your dream, it's mine. You invaded it because of our blood connection." The boy replied with a tone as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. The look in his eyes really made her furious again. However, this time she listened carefully to his words, Rhaenys looking shocked at the boy next to her. Spinning around, she got up and sat on the boy while bringing her face dangerously close to his. The lilac eyes staring into the purple eyes with intensity. "What did you just say?" she asked in a voice that resembled a growl. "What a pity, Princess Rhaenys Targaryen is deaf. What a sorry fate for House Targaryen." The boy showed no fear and spoke with all the boldness and sarcasm she saw in a person. "Who are you?" Rhaenys asked with a threatening tone, or rather what she thought was threatening, but a 9-year-old girl could hardly be considered threatening. The boy didn't answer and looked at her in silence for a moment, as if pondering his next words. "I'm currently Jon Snow." He spoke with no intention of hiding it. When he finally answered, Rhaenys looked angrily at the boy who called himself Jon Snow. "You lie," she said, certain of her own conjecture. After all, from head to toe, the boy she was sitting next to didn't look like a northern bastard. "I have another name, but you'd rather see it than me answer," Jon replied, raising his hand, and the whole atmosphere began to change. Rhaenys opened her eyes wide and found herself in front of a room in a tower, which she recognized immediately. The Tower of Joy. It was the tower that her father had named and brought her and her mother to spend a few weeks in. However, Rhaenys' eyes were soon fixed on the figure on the bed. "Arg har!" The woman let out a scream that sent a shiver down Rhaenys' spine, but the 9-year-old didn't look away, concentrating entirely on the woman. Lyanna Stark, her second Muna. Chapter 14, The Princess of Vengeance 2. How many dynasties have collapsed under conspiracies, lies, and assassinations? Countless in human history. No dynasty was eternal, but I want to make one that is eternal. Aenar Targaryen, sitting on the Iron Throne. Rhaenys had met Lyanna when she was still pregnant. She didn't understand why she had to call another woman Muna, but since her father and mother had asked her to, she had done it. In the end, she lost both Munas. Under Rhaenys' shocked eyes, Lyanna was giving birth, and it didn't take a genius to know the identity of the boy at that moment. She had witnessed everything, from Aenar's birth to the moment Eddard Stark rushed into the room, finding his Muna on the verge of death, a large pool of blood beneath her. Rhaenys felt tears gathering in her eyes. Despite promising herself that she would never cry again, she couldn't hold back the hot drops that slid relentlessly down her cheeks. "Promise me, Ned. Promise me. You must protect him. If Robert finds out about him, he'll kill him. You must protect him, protect him." Rhaenys sniffled, wiping away the tears that kept streaming down her face. She watched Lyanna with a mixture of sorrow and admiration, while she, in her last breath, still thought of her son's safety rather than her own. Then Rhaenys' world changed again. She was no longer in the Tower of Joy, but back in the Field of Flowers, where a deafening silence now hung in the air. I hate to see that moment, but my mind always goes back to that moment. Her death is something I hate with all my might. The worst thing is knowing that if she had been in the Red Keep, surrounded by the best Meisters, she would have survived. Rhaenys listened to her brother speak, his voice calm but emanating a sense of sadness that she was all too familiar with. She knew exactly that pain, the pain of losing her ground in heaven. Brother. A word she never thought she would have to address to another person again. And yet here she was, standing in front of her younger brother. Looking down at him still lying in the sea of blue flowers, Rhaenys moved closer and brought him into the comfort of her bosom while stroking his hair tenderly. "There, there," she whispered in his ear, trying to convey as much comfort as possible. It was a big sister's duty to look after her little brother, and at that moment, that was exactly what she was doing. She couldn't do it with Aegon, but she could keep her promise to Lyanna with Aenar. Jon looked at the 9-year-old girl trying to comfort him and was speechless. He wasn't a child. How could he need comfort from a girl who wasn't even 10 years old? However, he didn't move and let her do what she wanted, because it wasn't that he was being consoled, but also Rhaenys. As he had imagined, he soon felt his shoulder get wet. Her embrace, instead of loosening, became tighter as time passed, as if Rhaenys feared that everything around her would disappear in a dream, which, in a way, it really was. Suddenly, feeling the connection between them weaken, Jon looked up at the girl who was still holding him tightly and spoke gently. "You're about to wake up, Rhaenys." At his words, her embrace became even more intense. Rhaenys felt the heat of shame rise to her face as she realized that she had cried in front of her younger brother. She looked at the boy with the incredibly adorable features and, with a threatening tone, declared, "Call me Ray." Seeing the look on her face, Jon couldn't help but want to squeeze her cheeks, but he held back and obeyed her earlier request. "Ray." A big smile appeared on Rhaenys' lips. She never thought she would hear something so intimate and sweet come from her brother's lips again. Before she could say anything, darkness swirled before her, and before she knew it, she was in her room in Sunspear, in the chair she had fallen asleep in earlier. Looking around desperately, Rhaenys couldn't find the figure of the boy with the white gold hair and purple eyes. This brought a feeling of extreme anxiety to her chest, as if someone was holding her feelings in their hand and squeezing as hard as they could, leaving her breathless. Slumping helplessly in her chair, the Targaryen princess hiding under an alias in Dorne couldn't help but stare at the ceiling of the room with an expressionless, lifeless gaze. How did it feel to hope and then find out that it was all just a lie? Rhaenys could answer that question with extreme accuracy. It was as if the world had lost its color, even the most delicious food had no taste and the sweetest wine seemed like candle wax. Happiness, joy, feelings had completely disappeared, leaving her with only an empty, indifferent shell in a relentless pursuit of revenge and hatred. No, that can't be a dream. Rhaenys thought fiercely as she rose from her chair. There was a way to find out if what she had dreamt was real or just a hallucination in the face of her neediness and extreme desires to have a family again. At 9 years old, Rhaenys was intelligent and mature for her age, coming to terms with her thoughts in an instant. "Ask Uncle Oberyn what happened at the Tower of Joy." Slapping both hands against both cheeks, Rhaenys regained the sparkle in her eyes. She slipped her silk shoes on quickly, didn't wait for the maids to arrive to fix her hair, and went straight out of the room. The sun streamed through the windows of the old palace's corridors like tentacles of light, bathing the sandy walls in a pale shade of gold. Rhaenys' steps were quick and particularly silent. She ignored the countless doors and corridors, focusing on getting to the place where her uncle would be all morning. The courtyard where he trained every day at the same time of day. As she expected, Rhaenys found her uncle wielding a spear as skillfully as an extension of his body. The spear could suddenly change direction and arc through the air, like a snake striking its prey. His movements weren't pretty, they were deadly and precise. Prince Oberyn has the characteristics of a salty Dornish. He is a tall, slender, graceful and fit man with a wrinkled saturnine face with thin eyebrows, black viper eyes and a pointed nose. His hair was a lustrous shade of black, with just a few silver locks from age. Rhaenys didn't have to wait long before his uncle stopped training to catch his breath. Wiping the sweat dripping from his forehead, he let out a satisfied sigh and cracked his neck. His eyes narrowed viciously, almost like a snake's, which could seem extremely threatening to anyone. "Father," Rhaenys called out, approaching him. In order to hide her identity from the spies in Sunspear, she was just another of Oberyn Martell's bastards with a prostitute in Lys. At the same time, she had been given a new name. Rhaena. Oberyn turned and greeted his niece, whom he had raised as his own daughter, with a gentle, warm smile, a totally different expression from when he spoke to anyone else. "Rhaena Sand. Did you sleep well?" he asked, stroking his niece's tousled hair, something not very elegant for a southern lady, but irrelevant in Dorne. "I want to ask you something." Rhaenys didn't answer and asked, looking straight into her uncle's eyes. Raising an eyebrow in doubt, he looked at the 9-year-old girl with a touch of curiosity and spoke. "Ask away, child." "I want to ask if Eddard Stark has a bastard called Jon Snow." Rhaenys was direct, without hiding her intentions. Although he was becoming increasingly surprised and confused, he still answered truthfully. "Yes, he has a bastard called Jon Snow. I remember it because it was a hot topic at the time. The Honorable Eddard Stark, with his impeccable reputation, had his honor tarnished at that time." Rhaenys sighed with relief and smiled brightly. Although she didn't know if Jon was really Enar, her brother. Now at least she had hoped that the dream she'd had last night was real and not a hallucination of her brain. As long as Jon Snow was a real person, the dream was real too. After all, she had never heard that name before, but in the dream she had met him and even spoken to him, as well as fought with him and learned about his origins. How could something like that be her imagination? However, Rhaenys' cheerful, innocent smile made Oberyn's eyes widen in complete surprise. How many years had it been since he had seen his niece smile like that, so sweet, gentle and genuinely happy, unlike the forced smile she had most of the time. Although he didn't know what caused this happiness, Oberyn didn't care. As long as she was happy, he was more than satisfied. "I'm going to take a bath and we'll break our fast together with my brother." Oberyn stroked her hair once more and spoke in a gentle, laughing tone. Not giving her time to reply, he left holding his spear, leaving little Rhaenys alone in the courtyard with a happy and joyful expression. Chapter 15, The Princess of Vengeance 3. Happy New Year and a good end to the year to everyone. I hope to have a pleasant start to the year and a prosperous year ahead. Decisions must be made indifferently. Emotions, desires and responsibilities are something that any ruler must separate properly. Doran Martell, Prince of Dorne. POV, Doran Martell, Prince of Dorne. Dorne Sunspear. Old Palace, Dining Hall. Doran Martell was a man of 47, with black hair with weathered gray tips falling over his shoulders, deep black eyes and a serious, rather cold face. He wore fine gold Dornish robes and sat in a wheelchair. The boy's information tells us more and more that Eddard Stark has fooled everyone. Doran muttered with a pensive look on his face. He was like that, thinking about every word, every action, always trying to make the best choice for House Martell and Dorne. Jon Snow. Doran chewed the boy's name in his mouth, not sure at the moment if his suspicions were true or just his paranoia saying something impossible. But he had never been a man who believed in morality and honor. He believed in family above all else, and his instincts told him that Eddard was a similar man. He could sacrifice his own honor and marriage to protect his family, even if it meant having his own head cut off by the king. Tapping his finger rhythmically on the table, Doran didn't even notice that his daughter had sat down next to him to break her morning fast. "You look pensive, father. Something is troubling you." Hearing the voice next to him, Doran followed it with his dark eyes and fixed his gaze on the girl with tan skin and curly black hair. She wore an almost transparent blue silk dress and a lot of jewelry, and though she was 13, she was small even for a woman. His heir, Arianne Martell. Doran liked his daughter. She was cunning, deadly like any Martell, and most of all, he could use all her advantages to his advantage. That was what he was looking for in an heir. Unfortunately, Arianne was a woman. Even though Dorne did not have as many customs as the South, and a woman could rule Dorne, Doran did not want a woman to take the sun throne of Dorne. He was someone who believed that women were fickle and prone to the love of men, which was a danger in his eyes. Would Arianne or her husband rule Dorne? Though the chances were slim, he wasn't about to risk his family's fate on luck or anything else. However, his male children proved to be one disappointment after another. Quentyn and Trystane were two ends of the same coin. Quentyn, although intelligent, was full of doubts, fears and insecurities, almost like a child who hadn't grown up and constantly needed his father's support. Trystane, on the other hand, was his youngest son, too young and too kind for his own good. Letting out a sigh, Doran didn't let his thoughts show on his face and brought the golden wine glass to his lips. As for his daughter's question, he didn't bother to answer. There were very few people who could make him talk if he didn't want to, and his daughter was definitely not one of them. Although the smile on her lips still remained the same, Arianne felt an overwhelming sadness seeing her father's indifference towards her. She wasn't stupid and she could see that Doran loved her, but not to the point of caring enormously about her, which hurt her. Sometimes she wanted to have a dick to see if Doran would pay more attention to her than to her brothers, who had always been her father's main focus, even though she was the legitimate heiress of Sunspear. While father and daughter stood in silence having similar but completely different thoughts, the doors to the dining hall opened and Oberyn, Illyria and Rhaena entered. Doran didn't notice his other nieces, his brother's bastard daughters, probably not in the old palace at the moment, perhaps venturing into the desert of Dorne. The Prince of Dorne's dark eyes fell on the 9-year-old girl, her lilac eyes indicating some kinship with the ancient Valyria. Everyone thought just another of Oberyn's bastards, but he knew it was his sister Elia Martell's daughter with Prince Rhaegar of House Targaryen, the true heir to the Iron Throne, although he knew that no lord would accept a woman as queen, which made his choices rather delicate and risky for the future of House Martell. But to Doran's surprise, the girl didn't have the feigned expression of happiness she usually wore. Instead, she sported a big smile on her lips. The girl was traumatized by the death of her family, which had taken place in front of her, and she rarely smiled. He didn't blame her. The death of Elia and his nephew had been a huge blow to him and Oberyn, who were still furious about what had happened. If he hadn't had a calm mind, 6 years ago he would have headed for King's Landing with his army. "You look happy, cousin," Arianne said, looking at the 9-year-old girl with a surprised look. If she thought about it, it was the second time she had seen her cousin smile so happily. The first was when she had received the news that Queen Rhaella and her 2 daughters were safe in Essos. That was 4 years ago, and for all that time, Arianne had never seen Rhaena smile as innocently as before. But today she saw the same smile on her cousin's sweet lips again. "A pleasant evening, dear cousin," Rhaenys replied with a smile as she looked at her cousin with a warm look in her lilac eyes. Although the Martells were not her real family, they treated her with all possible care and love. Arianne in particular spent some nights in her room to comfort her after long nights of nightmares. "Uncle, I'd like to make a request." Rhaenys looked at her uncle Doran, who had an impassive, cold expression. His lilac eyes were fixed on the most powerful man in Dorne. Doran looked at Rhaenys and noticing his niece's appraising gaze, he raised an eyebrow and replied, "You may do so, dear niece. I want all the information about Jon Snow, Eddard Stark's bastard." Rhaenys didn't hesitate to speak her purpose. As to what everyone would think of her request, she didn't care. Enar's identity would be revealed sooner or later. If Doran discovered Enar's identity, there would be no bad consequences. On the contrary, it would make her uncle bet even more on her brother. Doran blinked a few times for a moment and glanced discreetly at his younger brother, Oberyn, who shook his head, saying he hadn't said anything. He didn't answer right away and brought the glass containing the wine to his lips as he analyzed the 9-year-old girl. He knew his niece's every move, who she had spoken to or even trained with during that time. It wasn't paranoia, but because of his niece's sensitive identity, everyone she spoke to had to be monitored in case she leaked her true identity for some reason. Although Dorne was strong, the other side had 6 entire kingdoms, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, while Dorne had around 30,000 men. That number was nowhere near enough to withstand Robert Baratheon's rage. Especially at this time when the king was at the height of his prestige, defeating the rebellion of House Greyjoy. Not one person in the old palace had mentioned anything about Jon Snow, and there was certainly no way that people of unknown origins could get close to his niece, so he had severe doubts as to how Rhaenys had managed to learn that name. "Why do you ask about him, niece?" Doran asked, his dark eyes fixed on the girl's lilac ones. He couldn't let on that she had the same indomitable look that his sister had. Arianne bit into a piece of bread as her eyes wandered between her cousin and father, the intensity in the air suddenly heightened. Jon Snow? A bastard from the north. But what has a bastard done to gain the attention of her father and cousin? Arianne thought as curiosity began to creep into her gaze. "You shouldn't ask a lady's secrets, dear uncle." Rhaenys replied with an innocent smile as she looked at her uncle with a slightly sarcastic gaze. Rhaenys' words caused Oberyn and Illyria to burst out laughing. "How rude of you to ask a lady's secrets, brother. It seems I have to remind you how to treat a woman." Oberyn spoke with a smile on his face, seeing the helpless expression on his brother's face made his day. How long had it been since he'd seen that expression? Doran let out a sigh and stroked his forehead, listening to the muffled laughter in the dining room. He had no doubt his niece really was his sister's daughter. Mother and daughter were so alike that the girl was practically the second coming of Elia in his eyes. Looking at his younger brother with a cold stare causing both lovers to fall silent, Doran turned his gaze back to his niece and spoke quietly. "Although I'm curious as to how you know that name, I'll send some documents to your room." Rhaenys put on a cheerful look and began to eat with intensity and fervor, something that everyone around had not seen her do for a long time.